The making of a killer. Charles Edmund Cullen was born February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children. His childhood, by his own account, was miserable. When Charles was just 7 months old, his father died, leaving his mother to raise 8 children alone. The family struggled financially and emotionally. Young Charles became a target, bullied relentlessly at school, tormented by his sister's boyfriends at home. He retreated inward, nursing wounds that would later metastasize into something unspeakable. By age 9, Cullen made his first suicide attempt. It wouldn't be his last. Throughout his life, he would attempt to take his own life at least 20 times, jumping off buildings, overdosing on medications, crashing his car intentionally. Each time, he survived. Each time, the darkness inside him grew. After a brief stint in the Navy that ended with a medical discharge, Cullen found his calling, or perhaps his hunting ground. In 1987, he became a registered nurse. To the world, it seemed like a noble career choice for someone who'd known suffering. But Cullen had discovered something else. Hospitals gave him access to vulnerable people and powerful drugs, all behind closed doors where death was common and questions were rare. The first kill, June 11, 1988. St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. Judge John Yengo Sr., recovering from cardiac surgery, received an injection he hadn't been prescribed. Within minutes, his heart stopped. Medical staff rushed to revive him, but the judge died on the operating table. The cause was later determined to be a lethal overdose of intravenous medication. Charles Cullen, the night shift nurse who'd administered that fatal dose, showed no emotion as the family grieved. He simply clocked out and went home. It was the beginning of a killing spree that would span 9 hospitals, 2 states, and 16 years. But what makes Cullen's case truly horrifying isn't just the body count, it's that hospital after hospital knew something was wrong and did nothing. A pattern emerges, and is ignored. At St. Barnabas, the deaths continued. An AIDS patient died after Cullen gave him an overdose of insulin. More patients coded unexpectedly on Cullen's shifts. When hospital authorities began investigating contaminated IV bags in 1992, signs pointed to Cullen. But instead of calling police, St. Barnabas simply asked all licensed practical nurses, including Cullen, to resign. No criminal investigation, no report to nursing authorities, no warning to future employers. The hospital's silence was a death warrant for dozens of future victims. Cullen immediately found work at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. Within weeks, the pattern resumed. 3 elderly women died from overdoses of digoxin, a heart medication. One survivor reported a sneaky male nurse had injected her as she slept, but healthcare providers dismissed her claims as confusion. When Cullen was given a lie detector test, he passed, his sociopathic calm registering as honesty. He continued working. Next came Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington. Cullen later admitted to murdering 5 patients between January and September 1996 using digoxin overdoses. Hospital records for his first 2 years there had been conveniently destroyed by the time of his 2003 arrest, leaving the true death toll unknown. Dozens of families would never know if their loved ones died naturally or were murdered. At Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Cullen was accused of giving patients drugs at unscheduled times. He was caught entering a patient's room with syringes, an encounter that left the elderly patient with a broken arm. One patient's death was blamed on another nurse entirely. Cullen's guilt undiscovered. He was fired, but again, no criminal report was filed. The hospitals were playing a deadly game of pass the trash, shuffling a serial killer between facilities to avoid lawsuits and bad publicity. The killing accelerates. By the time Cullen arrived at Easton Hospital in late 1998, he'd perfected his method. On December 30, 1998, another patient died from a lethal dose of digoxin. A coroner's blood test showed the poison clearly, but the hospital's internal investigation was inconclusive. They let Cullen quietly resign. St. Luke's Hospital in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was next. then Lehigh Valley Hospital, then Sacred Heart Hospital in Allentown. At each facility, patients died unexpectedly. At each facility, questions were raised. And at each facility, administrators chose reputation over responsibility. Why? Because reporting Cullen meant admitting they'd employed a killer. It meant lawsuits, investigations, devastating publicity. It meant acknowledging their oversight had cost lives. So instead, they wrote neutral reference letters, allowed him to resign voluntarily, and sent him on to the next hospital where he would kill again. The system was protecting the killer, not the patients. The national nursing shortage conspiracy. How did Cullen keep finding work despite his trail of death and suspicious resignations? The answer is both simple and damning. America's healthcare system was desperate. A nationwide nursing shortage meant hospitals couldn't afford to be picky. They needed warm bodies in scrubs, and Cullen had credentials. His frequent job changes could be explained away as restlessness or seeking better opportunities. Background checks were minimal, reference checks were cursory, and his previous employers, bound by fear of defamation lawsuits, said nothing about their suspicions. Even Cullen's documented mental instability, multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, suicide attempts, bizarre behavior raised no red flags. In 2002, after another suicide attempt landed him in a psychiatric facility, Cullen was released and went right back to work. The mental health system didn't communicate with the nursing board. The nursing board didn't investigate patterns of suspicious activity. Charles Cullen was free to kill because every institution that could have stopped him chose self-preservation instead. Somerset Medical Center, the end game. In September 2002, Cullen took a position at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. He would later describe his time there as his most prolific killing period. Patients died with disturbing frequency on his shifts, but this time, two things were different. First, Somerset had recently installed a sophisticated medication tracking system. Every drug access left a digital fingerprint. Second, one person refused to look away. Reverend Florian Gall, a 68-year-old Catholic priest and hospital board member, died on June 28, 2003, after being admitted for a relatively minor heart condition. His death was unexpected, his decline rapid. His grieving family asked questions that wouldn't go away. The hospital administrator, feeling the pressure, finally did what his predecessors had failed to do. He investigated. The computer records told a damning story. Cullen had accessed medications for patients who weren't his. He'd withdrawn drugs that had no legitimate medical purpose for those patients. The pattern was unmistakable. On October 31, 2003, Somerset Medical Center took the unprecedented step of notifying law enforcement. The New Jersey Poison Control Center reviewed patient deaths and found lethal levels of digoxin in multiple victims. The death toll was staggering. Charles Cullen was finally caught. But he was caught by data, not by the dozens of healthcare professionals who'd suspected him for over a decade. The confession. When detectives first interviewed Cullen, he was calm, almost relieved. On December 12, 2003, at a diner in Bridgewater, New Jersey, he began to confess. The admissions poured out over days of interrogation, each one more horrifying than the last. He confessed to killing at least 40 patients, though he couldn't remember them all. Some he'd killed out of mercy, to end their suffering, he claimed, but investigators quickly dismantled that rationalization. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill. Some were expected to recover fully. Others were in the hospital for minor procedures. Cullen confessed to using digoxin because it was easy to access and hard to detect. He used insulin because it caused quick cardiac distress that looked like natural complications. He chose victims randomly, whoever was vulnerable when his urge to kill arose. When asked why, Cullen struggled to articulate a coherent motive. He spoke vaguely about feeling stressed and wanting to relieve suffering, but psychiatric evaluations would later reveal a more disturbing truth. Charles Cullen killed because he could, because he liked the power, because hospitals had taught him that he could murder with impunity. In 2004, Cullen pleaded guilty to murdering 13 patients and attempting to kill 2 others in New Jersey. He later pleaded guilty to 3 more murders and 3 attempted murders in Pennsylvania. In total, he admitted to 29 confirmed killings, though investigators believe the true number is exponentially higher. He was sentenced to 18 consecutive life terms plus 397 years in prison. He will never be eligible for parole. The Baby Killer. Texas almost set free. Chelsea McClellan was 14 months old when her mother brought her to the pediatrician's office in Kerrville, Texas on September 17, 1982. It was supposed to be a routine visit, immunizations, a quick checkup, nothing more. Chelsea was a happy, healthy toddler with bright eyes and her whole life ahead of her. She would be dead within the hour. As Chelsea's mother, Petty McClellan, watched in horror, the nurse, a woman named Janine Jones, gave her daughter the first injection. Chelsea immediately began gasping for air. Before Petty could react, Jones administered a second shot. The little girl went limp and stopped breathing entirely. In the chaos of rushing Chelsea to the hospital, Jones somehow inserted herself into the ambulance. There, out of sight of Chelsea's frantic mother, she gave the dying child a third injection. This one containing succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic that stops all muscle function, including the diaphragm. Chelsea's tiny heart stopped beating. The little girl who'd walked into the clinic on her own 2 feet would never walk again. Her crime? Being in the care of a nurse who'd already murdered dozens of babies and wouldn't stop until someone forced her to. But here's the most terrifying part of this story. 35 years later, Texas was about to let Janine Jones walk free. The making of a monster. Janine Jones was born in July 1950 and raised in San Antonio, Texas. Her childhood was marked by instability. She would later describe feeling unwanted and searching for purpose. In 1977, she completed her training as a licensed vocational nurse, LVN, a position that requires less education than a registered nurse, but still provides significant patient care responsibilities. By all accounts, Jones loved working with children. She sought positions in pediatric units and seemed genuinely excited about caring for the most vulnerable patients. To families, she appeared attentive and caring. To colleagues, she was hardworking, even eager, sometimes too eager to be involved in emergency situations. In 1981, Jones landed a position in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Bayard County Hospital, now University Hospital of San Antonio, one of the largest public hospitals in Texas. The PICU treated the sickest children in the region, premature infants fighting for every breath, toddlers with congenital heart defects, babies recovering from major surgeries. It should have been a place of healing. Instead, Janine Jones turned it into a killing field. The epidemic nobody wanted to see. Between 1981 and early 1982, something inexplicable was happening in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Bayard County Hospital. Children were coding, suffering sudden catastrophic cardiac arrests at an alarming rate, almost exclusively during the 3:11 p.m. evening shift. The numbers were staggering. During a 15-month epidemic period, children on that shift were 25 times more likely to suffer cardiac arrest and 10 times more likely to die than at any other time or at comparable facilities. An expert from the Centers for Disease Control would later confirm what should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. This wasn't bad luck or coincidence. Someone was killing these children. That someone was Janine Jones. Dr. James Robotham, the unit's medical director, began noticing the pattern in late 1981. Emergency codes were happening with disturbing frequency, and they seemed to cluster around certain staff members, particularly Jones. He started keeping meticulous records, documenting every code, every death, every suspicious incident. In one particularly damning analysis, hospital administrators discovered that between May and December 1981, 10 children had died of sudden and unexplained complications. Janine Jones had been the nurse caring for every single one of them. An internal investigation was launched in early 1982. The findings were clear. There was a statistically impossible correlation between Jones's presence and pediatric deaths. The evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion: Janine Jones was murdering babies. But instead of calling the police, Bayard County Hospital made a decision that would cost more children their lives. The cover-up that killed. Faced with evidence of serial murder in their pediatric ICU, hospital administrators chose institutional self-preservation over child safety. The reason was brutally simple. Admitting they'd employed a baby killer would destroy the hospital's reputation and trigger devastating lawsuits. So they crafted a solution that protected the hospital while leaving Jones free to kill again. In March 1982, Bayard County Hospital announced it would be restructuring the pediatric ICU. All licensed vocational nurses, including Jones, would be asked to resign. The unit would be staffed exclusively with registered nurses going forward. It was presented as an upgrade in care standards. In reality, it was a mass firing designed to remove Jones without explicitly accusing her, thereby avoiding legal liability. The plan was cowardly and catastrophic. By not reporting Jones to law enforcement or the Texas Board of Nursing, the hospital ensured she could simply move on to the next job. And that's exactly what she did. With a reference letter from Bayard County Hospital that mentioned nothing about the investigation, Janine Jones had no trouble finding new employment. In August 1982, just 5 months after being forced out, she was hired at a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. The doctors who hired her had no idea they were bringing a serial killer into an office full of healthy children. Kerrville. The killing continues. Dr. Kathleen Holland had recently opened her pediatric practice in Kerrville and needed an experienced pediatric nurse. Janine Jones's resume was impressive. Years of PICU experience at a major hospital, her references were solid. She seemed perfect for the position. Within weeks of Jones starting work in August 1982, the pattern resumed with horrifying precision. On August 27th, 4-week-old Brandy Benitez was brought in for a routine checkup. After an injection from Jones, the baby stopped breathing. Emergency resuscitation saved her life, but just barely. 3 days later, on August 30th, both Chris Parker and Jimmy Pearson came to the clinic for regular appointments. After receiving injections from Jones, both children suffered respiratory crises. They survived, but their parents were shaken. On September 3rd, Misty Reichenau arrived for a checkup. Jones administered an injection. The baby immediately stopped breathing and required emergency intervention. Dr. Holland was perplexed. These were healthy children coming in for routine care, yet they were experiencing life-threatening emergencies at an impossible rate. Something was very wrong. Then, on September 17th, Chelsea McClellan arrived for her immunizations. Chelsea, the murder we could prove. Petty McClellan watched her daughter take her last breaths, and she knew something was horribly wrong. The nurse, Janine Jones, had given Chelsea an injection, and the little girl had immediately begun gasping for air. A second injection caused Chelsea to go limp. Petty was screaming for help, but it was already too late. As the medical team rushed Chelsea to a nearby hospital, Jones climbed into the ambulance uninvited. There, while Petty was focused on her dying daughter, Jones administered a third injection, one that would prove to be Chelsea's death sentence. At Sid Peterson Hospital, doctors fought desperately to save the toddler's life, but she was already gone. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. Healthy 14-month-olds don't just stop breathing during routine clinic visits. Dr. Holland was devastated and confused. Within weeks of hiring Jones, she'd had an unprecedented string of pediatric emergencies. Then she made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing her clinic's medication inventory, Dr. Holland found 2 puncture marks in a bottle of succinylcholine, a powerful paralytic drug used in surgical anesthesia. The bottle was stored in an area where only she and Jones had access. Someone had been withdrawing the drug with syringes, and Holland hadn't prescribed it for any patient. Succinylcholine is a terrifying substance. It paralyzes every voluntary muscle in the body, including those needed for breathing. A person injected with succinylcholine remains fully conscious and aware, but completely unable to move, speak, or breathe. They suffocate while fully conscious, unable to cry for help. This was how Janine Jones had been killing babies, by paralyzing them and watching them die, then swooping in to heroically attempt resuscitation. Dr. Holland immediately called law enforcement. Unlike the administrators at Bayard County Hospital, she chose to protect children over her clinic's reputation. The investigation begins. When investigators began examining Chelsea McClellan's death, the evidence was damning. Blood tests revealed lethal levels of succinylcholine in the toddler's system, a drug she had no medical reason to receive. The timeline was clear. Jones had administered 3 injections to Chelsea, and the third one had been the murder weapon. But Chelsea wasn't Jones's only victim at the Kerrville clinic. Investigators identified at least 5 other children who'd suffered mysterious respiratory crises after receiving injections from Jones during her brief time there. All had survived, but all bore the hallmarks of succinylcholine poisoning. Then investigators turned their attention to Bayard County Hospital. When they learned about the suspicious death cluster during Jones's employment there, they realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single murder. They were looking at one of the most prolific serial killers in Texas history. Between January 1981 and March 1982, dozens of children had died unexpectedly at Bayard County Hospital, almost all on the evening shift when Jones worked. Statistical analysis showed the correlation was impossible to explain by chance alone. An expert from the CDC calculated that children were 25 times more likely to suffer cardiac arrest when Jones was on duty. But here's where the investigation hit a devastating roadblock. Bayard County Hospital had destroyed most of the medical records. There was no physical evidence to test. Many victims had been cremated. Witnesses had moved on. The hospital's cover-up had effectively destroyed the ability to prosecute most of Jones's murders. Prosecutors faced a grim reality. They could prove Chelsea McClellan's murder and the assault on Rolando Santos. A month-old infant Jones had poisoned with heparin at the Kerrville clinic. But the dozens of babies killed at Bayard County Hospital? Those cases were now nearly impossible to prosecute. The hospital's decision to cover up rather than report had given Jones immunity for most of her murders. The trial: justice for one, betrayal for many. In February 1984, Janine Jones went on trial for the murder of Chelsea McClellan. The prosecution's case was powerful. Eyewitness testimony from Chelsea's mother, forensic evidence of succinylcholine in the toddler's blood, the punctured medication bottle, and the undeniable pattern of emergencies surrounding Jones. But Jones maintained her innocence. She claimed she was being scapegoated, that she was trying to stimulate the creation of a pediatric intensive care unit in Kerrville to serve the children of rural Texas. Her defense painted her as a dedicated nurse being blamed for tragic coincidences. The jury didn't believe her. On February 15, 1984, Janine Jones was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison, a term that should have meant she'd spend the rest of her life behind bars. Later that year, she was also convicted of injuring Rolando Santos with a lethal dose of heparin and sentenced to an additional 60 years to be served concurrently. Jones was officially charged with 5 additional assaults on children at the Kerrville clinic: Brandy Benitez, Chris Parker, Jimmy Pearson, Misty Reichenau, and Jacob Evans. All the indictments charged that Jones had intentionally and knowingly injured the children by injecting them with dangerous drugs. But she was never charged for the dozens of babies suspected to have died at Bayard County Hospital. The hospital's cover-up had ensured most of those murders would remain officially unsolved. Families of children who died at Bayard County Hospital were devastated. They knew Jones had likely killed their babies, but they would never see justice. Hospital administrators had prioritized institutional reputation over prosecuting a serial killer, and dozens of families paid the price. Britain's Angel of Death and the Children. she destroyed. Liam Taylor was just 7 weeks old when his mother brought him to Grantham and Kesthaven Hospital on February 21, 1991. The tiny infant had developed a chest infection, nothing unusual for a baby in the cold English winter, but concerning enough that his parents wanted medical attention. The nurse who greeted them was warm and reassuring. Beverly Allett, just 23 years old, told Liam's anxious parents that their son was in good hands. She encouraged them to go home and get some rest while the medical team monitored the baby overnight. Reluctantly, they agreed. When they returned to the hospital, Allett informed them that Liam had suffered a respiratory emergency during the night, but that he'd recovered. She volunteered to work extra hours to personally watch over him. How dedicated, how caring, his parents thought. They felt blessed to have such an attentive nurse. That night, alone with the sleeping infant, Beverly Allett murdered him. Liam's parents arrived the next morning to find medical staff frantically trying to resuscitate their son. His face was covered in strange red blotches. Alarms that should have sounded when he stopped breathing had mysteriously failed to activate. Within minutes, 7-week-old Liam Taylor was declared dead, the first victim of what would become one of Britain's most notorious serial killing sprees. Over the next 59 days, Allett would attack 12 more children on Ward 4. 4 would die. 3 would barely survive murder attempts. 6 would suffer permanent injuries. And every single attack happened when Beverly Allett was on duty, a statistical impossibility that should have been obvious to everyone paying attention. But it wasn't obvious because no one wanted to believe that the friendly, eager nurse could be a monster in disguise. The making of a monster. Beverly Gale Allett was born October 4, 1968, in the quiet village of Corby Glen, Lincolnshire. From the outside, her childhood appeared unremarkable, a modest family, working-class parents, a normal English upbringing. But beneath that ordinary exterior, something was deeply wrong. From an early age, Allett exhibited disturbing attention-seeking behavior. She would appear with unexplained injuries, cuts, bruises, burns that she couldn't or wouldn't explain coherently. She wore bandages and casts, claiming injuries that, when examined by doctors, proved to be either non-existent or self-inflicted. She visited medical facilities constantly, complaining of various ailments that never had organic causes. Her schoolmates noticed something off about her. She was manipulative, always at the center of drama, always demanding attention. But adults often dismissed these concerns as adolescent cattiness. After all, Beverly seemed so eager to help, so interested in caring for others. As a teenager, Allett became overweight and increasingly attention-seeking. She showed aggression toward peers, but maintained a facade of compliance around authority figures. She spent considerable time in hospitals, not as staff, but as a patient, seeking treatment for a parade of mysterious symptoms that doctors couldn't diagnose. In one particularly telling incident, Allett had her perfectly healthy appendix removed. She'd convinced doctors she had appendicitis through sheer persistence and manufactured symptoms. The surgery found nothing wrong, but Allett got what she craved: medical attention, sympathy, and time in a hospital environment. Despite this troubling pattern, Allett pursued nursing. In retrospect, the profession was the perfect fit for her pathology. It gave her access to vulnerable patients, powerful medications, and the medical emergencies that fed her addiction to attention. A troubled nursing student. Allett's nursing training should have ended her career before it began. Her record was abysmal. She missed 126 of 160 training days, constantly calling in sick with vague complaints. When she did attend, colleagues found her odd and untrustworthy. There were reports of feces smeared on walls in a nursing home where she trained. Behavior so bizarre it should have disqualified her from ever working with patients. She repeatedly failed her nursing exams. Her clinical performance was substandard. Her attendance was the worst anyone could remember. By any reasonable standard, Beverly Allett should never have been allowed to become a nurse. But Britain's National Health Service in 1991 faced a chronic nursing shortage. Hospitals were desperate for staff, willing to overlook red flags that should have been disqualifying. When Allett finally scraped through her training and earned her state-enrolled nurse qualification, Grantham and Kesteven Hospital offered her a temporary 6-month contract. It was February 1991. Ward 4, the children's ward, was chronically understaffed, sometimes just 2 trained nurses for an entire shift. They needed help desperately. They had no idea they'd just hired a serial killer. The first murder, Liam Taylor. 7-week-old Liam Taylor's death on February 23, 1991, was Allett's first confirmed kill, though the horror of it wasn't recognized at the time. His death was attributed to natural causes, tragic but explainable given his chest infection. But the circumstances were deeply suspicious. Liam had been improving before Allett's night shift. The alarms that should have alerted staff when he stopped breathing had failed to sound. Later investigation would suggest they'd been deliberately disabled, and the red blotches on his face were consistent with smothering, though this wasn't recognized immediately. Allett showed no emotion as Liam's devastated parents grieved. She clocked out, went home, and prepared for her next shift. The killing had been so easy, so satisfying. The attention and sympathy from colleagues as they comforted the family, the drama of the resuscitation attempt, the power of having decided when a life would end. It was intoxicating. She would kill again. Soon. The pattern emerges. On March 5, 1991, less than 2 weeks after Liam's death, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to Ward 4 for treatment of his epilepsy and cerebral palsy. Timothy was a gentle boy, vulnerable and trusting. His family had complete faith in the hospital staff. During Allett's shift, Timothy suddenly went into cardiac arrest. The medical team managed to revive him, but the incident was baffling. There was no medical explanation for why a child with his conditions would suddenly code. Nevertheless, Timothy was transferred to a larger hospital for specialist care. He died a week later, on March 12th. The official cause was listed as epilepsy complications, but later investigation would reveal that Allett had injected Timothy with a massive overdose of lignocaine, a drug that stops the heart. She'd murdered an 11-year-old disabled boy for no reason other than the thrill of creating an emergency. On March 21st, Kaylee Desmond, a 15-month-old recovering from a chest infection, suddenly went into cardiac arrest while under Allett's care. Against all odds, Kaylee survived, but with severe brain damage caused by oxygen deprivation. She would never fully recover. 4 days later, on March 25th, 5-month-old Paul Crampton was admitted with a minor chest infection. During Allett's shift, he suffered 3 separate hypoglycemic attacks, dangerously low blood sugar that caused him to nearly slip into a coma each time. The medical team was baffled. Paul wasn't diabetic. There was no reason for his blood sugar to plummet. Yet it kept happening, always on Allett's shifts. The doctors transferred Paul to Queen's Medical Center in Nottingham for specialist investigation. That's when they discovered something terrifying. Paul's blood contained massive amounts of insulin that hadn't been prescribed. Someone had been injecting him with the drug repeatedly, trying to kill him. The attacks accelerate, with Paul Crampton's case raising alarms. You'd think hospital authorities would have immediately investigated, but they didn't. The ward was understaffed, the workload overwhelming, and no one wanted to believe a nurse could be harming patients. So Allett continued hunting. On April 1st, 5-month-old Bradley Gibson was admitted with pneumonia. He suffered 2 cardiac arrests in rapid succession, both occurring during Allett's shifts. He survived, but barely. On April 5th, identical twins Becky and Katie Phillips, just 2 months old, were admitted for gastroenteritis, a common childhood illness that should have been easily treated. Becky was placed under Allett's care. That night, Allett murdered her. 2-month-old Becky Phillips suffered a sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest and died despite resuscitation attempts. The autopsy found nothing. The method Allett had used left no trace. Incredibly, even after their twin sister died in Ward 4, Katie Phillips was kept in the same ward under the care of the same nurse. When Allett's shift came around, Katie suddenly suffered 2 cardiac arrests. Medical staff managed to save her life, but she was left with severe brain damage and blindness. Allett had murdered 1 twin and permanently disabled the other. On April 12th, 15-month-old Claire Peck, who'd already survived heart surgery, was brought to Ward 4 for what should have been a minor procedure. During Alice's shift, Claire suffered a catastrophic cardiac arrest. The medical team fought desperately to save her, but Claire died. Later analysis would show that Alet had injected Claire with a massive dose of potassium, a lethal substance that causes the heart to stop immediately. The toddler who'd survived open-heart surgery was murdered by her nurse with a simple injection. The body count was mounting, but still no one wanted to accept what was happening on Ward 4. The investigation begins. By mid-April 1991, even the most reluctant hospital administrators couldn't ignore the crisis. Ward 4 had experienced an unprecedented spike in cardiac arrests, deaths, and mysterious medical emergencies. The numbers were staggering. In just 2 months, 13 children had suffered life-threatening incidents, and all of them had occurred when Beverly Alet was on duty. Dr. Nelson Porter, a senior pediatrician, began keeping detailed records. The pattern was undeniable. Medical emergencies clustered around Alet's shifts with statistical certainty. Dr. Nanayakara, another pediatrician, raised concerns to hospital management. Junior doctors at Queen's Medical Center in Nottingham, where some of Ward 4's victims had been transferred, were also sounding alarms. On April 22, 1991, after Claire Peck's death, the hospital finally contacted police. Detective Superintendent Stuart Clifton was assigned to the case. When he reviewed the duty rosters alongside the timeline of incidents, the answer jumped out immediately. Beverly Alet was present for every single suspicious event. The odds of this being coincidence? Later statistical analysis would put it at less than 1 in 10 million. Clifton suspended Alet from duty on April 30, 1991, just over 2 months after Liam Taylor's death. But he didn't arrest her, not yet. The evidence was circumstantial, and proving murder when the victims were sick children would be extraordinarily difficult. What Clifton didn't know was that his decision to suspend Alet likely saved lives. Even after being removed from Ward 4, Alet sought and obtained other medical positions before her arrest. She continued working with vulnerable people for months, wreaking havoc wherever she went, until she was finally taken into custody in November 1991. The suspension should have been enough to protect the public. Instead, the system failed again and again to stop her. Building the case. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex criminal cases in British medical history. Clifton assembled a team of forensic experts, toxicologists, and medical specialists to examine every incident on Ward 4 during Alet's employment. They started with Paul Crampton's case, the only living victim where they'd caught the attack in progress. Blood samples taken during Paul's hypoglycemic episodes showed astronomical levels of insulin paired with virtually no C-peptide, the protein the body produces naturally alongside insulin. This combination is definitive proof of exogenous insulin injection. Someone had been deliberately poisoning Paul. Next, they exhumed bodies. Becky Phillips, the murdered twin, had been buried. When forensic pathologists examined her remains, they found evidence of air embolism. Air bubbles deliberately injected into her bloodstream, causing instant cardiac arrest. It's a nearly undetectable method of murder, leaving minimal traces. The investigation expanded to other victims. Medical records that had seemed unremarkable at the time took on sinister meaning when examined through the lens of deliberate harm. Missing insulin vials from the medication refrigerator, with Alet having reported the key lost nursing logs that had mysteriously disappeared. Covering precisely the time periods when attacks occurred, Alet's name on medication access records for drugs that had no legitimate purpose. For the patients she accessed them for. Witnesses who remembered Alet being the last person alone with children before they suddenly coded 6 bodies were exhumed. Toxicology reports revealed insulin, potassium, and other substances in levels that could only indicate deliberate administration. In case after case, the evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Beverly Alet had been systematically attacking children on Ward 4. But perhaps the most damning evidence was the statistical analysis. Forensic statisticians calculated that the probability of all 13 incidents occurring coincidentally during Alet's shifts and never during shifts when she was absent, was astronomically small. The numbers didn't lie. Beverly Allett was a serial killer. The confession that exposed a decade of murder. On September 16, 2016, at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, a 49-year-old woman named Elizabeth Wetlaufer sat down with her addiction counselor and said something that would shake Canada to its core. "I need to tell you something. I've killed people, patients. I've killed 8 of them." The counselor, trained to handle confessions of substance abuse and personal trauma, was not prepared for this. As Wetlaufer continued talking, calmly, methodically, providing names and dates, the counselor realized she was listening to a serial killer confess to a decade-long murder spree. But here's what makes this case truly horrifying. Elizabeth Wetlaufer had confessed before. Multiple times. To a lawyer, to friends, to people who should have reported her to authorities. And every time, the system had failed to act. For nearly a decade, Wetlaufer had walked the hallways of long-term care facilities, carrying syringes filled with insulin, choosing victims among the most vulnerable people in society. Elderly residents who couldn't defend themselves, whose deaths would be attributed to old age and poor health. She called herself the Shadow of Death. She kept a journal documenting her kills. She told people what she was doing, and somehow, incredibly, she kept working as a nurse for years after her first murder. This is the story of how Canada's long-term care system failed so catastrophically that a serial killer operated in plain sight, and how it took a rehab counselor, not police, not hospital administrators, not regulatory bodies, to finally stop her. The making of a killer. Elizabeth May Wetlaufer was born in 1967 in Woodstock, Ontario, a small city about 100 miles southwest of Toronto. Her early life was marked by struggle and instability. She grappled with her sexual identity in an era and place where being gay was far less accepted than today. She struggled with mental health issues, including depression and later, addiction. In 1995, at age 28, Wetlaufer graduated from nursing school and became a registered nurse, a significant achievement given her personal challenges. For many people, nursing represents a calling to help others. For Wetlaufer, it would become something much darker. Within months of starting her first nursing job, the warning signs appeared. In 1995, Wetlaufer was caught stealing opioids from her workplace. It should have been a career-ending incident. Drug theft by a nurse is one of the most serious violations in healthcare. But instead of being permanently barred from nursing, she was simply fired from that particular job. She moved on to another facility, then another. The pattern would repeat throughout her career. Problems would surface, she'd be let go or resign, and she'd immediately find work somewhere else. Canada's fragmented healthcare system and chronic nursing shortage meant that red flags in one facility didn't follow her to the next. For 12 years, from 1995 to 2007, Wetlaufer worked at various long-term care facilities, struggling with addiction, mental health crises, and increasingly dark thoughts. Later, she would describe this period as a slow descent into darkness, a growing fascination with death and her power over it. Then, in August 2007, she finally acted on those dark impulses. The first murder, James Silcox. James Silcox was 84 years old, a World War II veteran and father of 6 who'd lived a full, honorable life. In August 2007, he was residing at Caretakers Care Nursing Home in Woodstock, Ontario, where Elizabeth Wetlaufer worked as a registered nurse. On August 11, 2007, Wetlaufer filled a syringe with insulin, far more than any diabetic patient would ever need. She entered Silcox's room, where the elderly veteran lay sleeping, vulnerable and trusting. She injected the insulin directly into his system. Within hours, Silcox's blood sugar plummeted dangerously low, sending his body into hypoglycemic shock. His organs began shutting down. He slipped into a coma and died. The death certificate listed natural causes. James Silcox was 84 years old and in declining health. His death seemed unremarkable to anyone not looking for signs of foul play. His family grieved, believing he'd simply reached the end of his natural life. But Elizabeth Wettlaufer knew the truth. She'd murdered him, and she'd gotten away with it so easily that she knew she could do it again. In her later confession, Wettlaufer would describe experiencing a sense of power and a perverse feeling of relief after killing Silcox. She claimed she'd been hearing voices urging her to kill them, hurt them. Whether this was genuine psychosis, a convenient excuse, or a combination of both remains debated by psychiatrists who've examined her. What's undeniable is that after successfully murdering James Silcox without detection, Wettlaufer crossed a threshold. The next murder would be easier, and the one after that even easier still. The killing spree accelerates. Between August 2007 and December 2007, Wettlaufer murdered 3 more residents at Caretakers. Maurice Granat, 84 years old, died October 25, 2007. Gladys Millard, 87 years old, died November 14, 2007. Helen Matheson, 95 years old, died December 22, 2007. 4 murders in 5 months. All insulin overdoses, all attributed to natural deaths of elderly residents in failing health. No one suspected a thing. Wettlaufer also attacked 2 elderly sisters during this period, Clotilda Adriano, 87, and Albina Demidaris, 88. She injected both with insulin between June and December 2007, but the doses weren't lethal. The sisters survived, suffering hypoglycemic episodes that were treated as diabetic complications, never recognized as murder attempts. Then, for nearly 4 years, the murders stopped, or rather, Wettlaufer claims they stopped. Given what we know about her lies and manipulation, it's impossible to be certain there weren't other victims during this period whose deaths she simply didn't confess to. What we do know is that Wettlaufer's personal life was deteriorating. Her addiction worsened. She cycled through relationships. Her mental health declined. She was fired from positions, struggled to maintain employment, and bounced between facilities. Yet somehow she kept getting hired as a nurse. The system that should have been protecting vulnerable patients instead kept giving a drug-addicted, mentally unstable nurse access to new victims. In January 2011, the killing resumed with devastating intensity. 2011 to 2014, the bloodiest years. Between January 2011 and August 2014, Wettlaufer murdered 4 more residents at Caretakers and attempted to murder several others. Mary Zurawinski, 96 years old, died January 11, 2011. Helen Young, 90 years old, died July 14, 2013. Maureen Pickering, 79 years old, died March 28, 2014. Arpad Horvath, 75 years old, died August 31, 2014. She also attempted to murder Wayne Hedges in 2011 and Sandra Towler in 2014, but both survived the insulin overdoses. By this point, Wettlaufer had refined her method. She knew exactly how much insulin to inject to trigger fatal hypoglycemia in elderly patients. She understood that deaths in long-term care facilities were rarely investigated thoroughly. Residents were expected to die, and when they did, it was generally assumed to be from natural causes. She also knew that insulin was the perfect murder weapon for a nurse. It's readily available in nursing homes where many residents are diabetic. It causes a rapid drop in blood sugar that mimics natural medical events. And crucially, it's difficult to detect after death, especially if no one is looking for it. But Wettlaufer was becoming increasingly reckless. She started keeping a journal documenting her killings. She began telling people what she was doing, cryptic hints at first, then more explicit confessions. It was as if part of her wanted to be caught, wanted someone to finally stop her. That's when she made her first explicit confession, to a lawyer. The confession that was kept secret. Sometime in 2014 or 2015, the exact date remains unclear, Elizabeth Wettlaufer sat in a lawyer's office and confessed to murdering patients. The details of exactly what she said and how explicit the confession was have never been made fully public, but we know the lawyer's response: keep it secret. The lawyer advised Wetlaufer that confessing to murder would obviously result in criminal prosecution and imprisonment. Rather than reporting the confession to police, as many would argue ethics and public safety demanded, the lawyer told Wetlaufer to remain silent. This decision would haunt the case for years. How many lives could have been saved if the lawyer had reported Wetlaufer in 2014 or 2015? Could Arpad Horvath, killed in August 2014, have been saved? What about the victims Wetlaufer attacked after leaving Caretakers care? The lawyer's decision raises profound questions about attorney-client privilege and the duty to protect public safety. In Canada, lawyer-client privilege is sacrosanct, one of the most protected relationships in law. But does that privilege extend to allowing a serial killer to continue practicing as a nurse with access to vulnerable victims? The legal community remains divided. Some argue the lawyer had no choice. Privilege is absolute. Others contend that ongoing danger to identifiable victims creates an exception to privilege that the lawyer should have invoked. What's undeniable is that Wetlaufer walked out of that office, secret intact, and continued working as a nurse. Fired, but not stopped. In September 2014, Caretakers Care finally fired Elizabeth Wetlaufer, but not for murder. They had no idea about the murders. She was fired for giving a patient the wrong medication, a serious error that raised concerns about her competence. It should have been the end of her access to patients. Instead, it was barely a speed bump. Within weeks, Wetlaufer had found new employment. She worked at Meadow Park Long-Term Care in London, Ontario, from September 2014 to November 2014. Then she took a position providing care to a private client through a temporary care agency. Even fired, even with a documented history of problems, she could still find work. The nursing shortage was that severe, and the coordination between facilities that poor. In October 2014, while working as a private caregiver, Wetlaufer attempted to murder Beverly Bertram, a 68-year-old woman receiving home care in Ingersoll, Ontario. She injected Bertram with insulin with intent to murder. Bertram survived, and the incident was never reported or investigated at the time. In March 2016, while working at Meadow Park, Wetlaufer attacked her final victim, James Silcox, no relation to her first victim of the same name, who survived the insulin overdose. By this point, Wetlaufer was spiraling. Her addiction was out of control. Her mental health was deteriorating. She'd been fired from multiple positions. She'd confessed to friends about hurting people at work, speaking in vague terms that some understood as admissions of murder, but that no one reported to authorities. Finally, in September 2016, at rock bottom and desperate for help with her addictions, Wetlaufer checked herself into the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, in Toronto. That's when everything unraveled. The confession that changed everything. On September 16, 2016, during a therapy session at CAMH, Elizabeth Wetlaufer made a full confession. Unlike her previous vague admissions or the confession kept secret by her lawyer, this time she provided specific details: names of victims, dates of deaths, descriptions of her methods. The counselor immediately recognized the legal and ethical obligation to report. She notified CAMH administrators, who contacted the College of Nurses of Ontario, CNO, and the Toronto Police Service. Within days, police had launched a full investigation. Wetlaufer herself sent an email to CNO stating, "I have deliberately harmed patients in my care and am now being investigated by the police for same." She also called a CNO investigator directly and provided additional details. CAMH staff faxed a 4-page handwritten confession to authorities. The confession was detailed and chilling. Wetlaufer described each killing methodically, how she'd chosen victims, how much insulin she'd used, how she'd felt afterward. She mentioned hearing red surges or voices urging her to kill. She described feeling powerful when she decided who would live and die. As police investigators dug into her claims, they made a horrifying discovery. Everything she was saying checked out. The patients she named had indeed died on the dates she specified. She'd been working at Caretakers during all the murders. Her descriptions of the facility layout and procedures were accurate. They had a serial killer who was not only confessing but providing a roadmap to prove her guilt. A German nurse murdered 85 patients to satisfy his God complex by creating emergencies and then heroically attempting resuscitation. The hero who killed to save, between 1999 and 2005, patients entering the intensive care units at Delmenhorst Hospital and Oldenburg Clinic in Germany were unknowingly placing their lives in the hands of one of history's most prolific serial killers. Niels Högel, a nurse described by colleagues as someone who openly and vigorously participated in resuscitation attempts, was secretly orchestrating the very medical crises he appeared so eager to resolve. Born in 1976, Högel didn't kill out of mercy, malice, or financial gain. He killed for something far more disturbing: the thrill of playing God, the adrenaline rush of emergency response, and the intoxicating applause that followed a successful resuscitation. In his own chilling words, he was driven by boredom and the excitement of resuscitation. To satisfy this perverse craving, he would deliberately inject patients with cardiovascular drugs, ajmaline, lidocaine, and others, inducing cardiac arrest so he could swoop in and attempt to save them. Sometimes he succeeded in reviving his victims, often he failed, but whether the patient lived or died seemed almost secondary to the performance itself, the chance to demonstrate his medical prowess, to be the center of attention, to feel the rush of holding a life in his hands. A pattern. Hidden in plain sight. The warning signs were there for those willing to see them. Mortality rates spiked dramatically wherever Högel worked. Medical emergencies requiring resuscitation occurred at statistically impossible rates during his shifts. Suspicious colleagues began to notice the pattern. Crisis after crisis, always when Niels was on duty, always with him at the center of the frantic response. Yet the machinery of institutional oversight moved with fatal slowness. When concerns mounted at one hospital, Högel was simply allowed to transfer to another, carrying his deadly practice with him. The system designed to protect patients instead enabled him to kill for 6 years across 2 facilities. The true scope of his crimes is almost incomprehensible. Högel was ultimately convicted of murdering 85 patients, men and women of varying ages, each admitted to the hospital seeking care and healing. But investigators suspect the actual death toll may exceed 300, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. Many potential victims had been cremated before suspicions arose, destroying evidence and leaving the full extent of his crimes unknowable. Justice delayed Högel's journey through the German legal system unfolded in stages that reflected the gradually emerging horror of what he'd done. In February 2015, he was convicted of 2 murders and several attempted murders, just the visible tip of a massive iceberg. As investigators dug deeper, exhuming bodies and reconstructing medication records, the true scale became clear. In January 2018, prosecutors filed a new indictment for 97 additional killings. By June 2019, Högel stood trial for what prosecutors called incomprehensible crimes. He was convicted of 85 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the presiding judge noting that his guilt in many other deaths could not be proven only because the evidence had been destroyed. Throughout his trial, Högel offered a glimpse into the twisted psychology behind his crimes. He admitted to the killings, describing an addiction to the emergency situations he created, the drama, the importance, the validation from colleagues who saw him as a skilled responder to crisis. What he failed to fully acknowledge was that every one of those crises was manufactured, every emergency a performance staged at the cost of human life. The betrayal of trust. The Högel case represents a particularly chilling perversion of the caregiving role. Patients and their families place extraordinary trust in medical professionals, especially in intensive care settings where lives hang in the balance. They assume that the person adjusting their IV or administering medication is working to save them. not considering whether that same person might be actively trying to kill them. This hero syndrome, killing to create opportunities for glory, inverts every principle of medical ethics. The Hippocratic Oath's command to first do no harm becomes instead a calculated infliction of harm for personal gratification. The nurse's role as advocate and protector becomes predator and performer. Currently serving a life sentence in a German prison, Högel's crimes prompted urgent calls for improved hospital oversight and investigation procedures. His case exposed systemic failures, the ease with which he accessed lethal drugs, the inability of institutions to recognize patterns of suspicious deaths, and the catastrophic consequences of simply transferring problematic staff rather than thoroughly investigating concerns. The patients who died under Niels Högel's care came to the hospital seeking healing. They received instead a betrayal so profound that it shook public confidence in medical institutions. Their families were left to reckon with an unbearable truth. Their loved ones didn't die from their illnesses or despite medical intervention. They died because of it, murdered by the very person charged with their care. In the annals of medical murder, few cases rival the scale and depravity of Niels Högel's crimes. A death toll measured not in dozens, but in hundreds, all to feed the ego of one man who wanted to be seen as a hero. A nurse created medical emergencies to gain the attention of her police officer boyfriend, while 350-plus deaths went uninvestigated. Killing for love. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where men who had survived combat could receive the care they'd earned through service to their country. Instead, between 1995 and 1996, it became a hunting ground for Kristen Gilbert, a registered nurse who murdered patients not for mercy, not for money, not even for the perverse thrill of playing God, but for something almost incomprehensibly trivial: the attention of her boyfriend. Born Kristen Heather Strickland on November 13, 1967, Gilbert had already demonstrated a capacity for cruelty before she ever became an RN. While working as a home health aide, she deliberately scalded a mentally handicapped child with hot water, an early warning sign that should have barred her from ever working in healthcare. Instead, she advanced in her career, eventually securing a position at the VA hospital where she would become one of America's most prolific medical murderers. Her method was brutally simple. She would inject patients with epinephrine, a powerful stimulant that sent their hearts into violent, irregular rhythms, triggering cardiac arrest. The hospital's policy required that a VA police officer be present at all medical emergencies, a safety protocol that Gilbert weaponized for romance. Her boyfriend, James Perot, was one of those officers. Every code she called, every crisis she created, brought him running to her side. A pattern of death and negligence. The numbers tell a story of both murder and institutional failure almost too staggering to comprehend. Gilbert was ultimately convicted of killing 4 patients: Kenneth Cutting, Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Huden, and Edward Squira. She was also convicted of attempting to murder 2 others. But FBI investigators determined she was present for approximately 350 deaths and more than 300 medical emergencies during her time at the facility, a statistical impossibility that screamed for investigation. Yet for years, no one looked closely enough. The cardiac arrests when Gilbert was on duty weren't treated as evidence of foul play, but as terrible coincidence, tragic bad luck in a facility caring for aging veterans with compromised health. Statistical analysis would later make the pattern undeniable. Medical emergencies clustered around Gilbert's shifts with mathematical precision that ruled out chance. The FBI investigation revealed the full horror of her conduct. She didn't just kill patients. She abandoned them in their final moments, forcing untrained colleagues to operate defibrillators while she stood back, creating the chaos that would summon Perot. She timed her murders to coincide with his duty schedule, manufacturing emergencies when he would be available to respond. Each code blue was both a crime scene and a twisted romantic gesture. The betrayal of those who served. The victims, Kenneth Cutting, Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Hudon, Edward Squira, and likely hundreds more, were veterans. They had survived wars, endured combat, made it home against the odds. They had earned their care through sacrifice and service, and they were murdered in the one place that should have been safest by a person whose job was to protect them for a reason so shallow it defies comprehension, so a nurse could flirt with a police officer. The perversity of the motivation sets Gilbert apart even in the grim catalog of medical murderers. She wasn't ending suffering or asserting control over death. She wasn't even seeking the hero's recognition that drove killers like Niels Hogel. She was simply lonely, seeking connection, willing to kill elderly veterans to create opportunities for romance. The lives of the patients under her care, men who had served their country, who had families waiting for them, who trusted the VA to honor the promise of care, meant nothing compared to her desire for James Perrault's attention. Justice and consequences. The legal reckoning came slowly but decisively. In 1998, Gilbert was convicted of calling in a bomb threat to the hospital, an attempt to delay an investigation into the suspicious deaths. On March 14, 2001, a federal jury convicted her of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury faced a grave decision: whether to recommend the death penalty for a woman who had murdered at least 4 patients and likely contributed to hundreds more deaths. They chose life imprisonment, perhaps recognizing that execution would be too quick an end for someone whose crimes had been so calculated and cold. Gilbert was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. In 2003, she dropped her federal appeal, a strategic decision made after a Supreme Court ruling that would have allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty in a retrial. She remains incarcerated at FMC Carswell, a federal medical center in Fort Worth, Texas, where she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. A systems failure. The Gilbert case exposed catastrophic vulnerabilities in the Veterans Affairs hospital system. How could 350 suspicious deaths occur without triggering an investigation? How could hundreds of medical emergencies cluster around one nurse's shifts without raising immediate alarm? The answers pointed to systemic failures: inadequate statistical monitoring, a reluctance to suspect healthcare workers of wrongdoing, and a bureaucratic inertia that protected institutions at the expense of individual patients. The case prompted calls for better oversight, more rigorous statistical analysis of mortality patterns, and faster responses when unusual death clusters emerge. But for the veterans who died under Gilbert's care, and for the families who trusted that the VA would keep their loved ones safe, these reforms came too late. Kristen Gilbert's crimes represent a unique and disturbing category of medical murder, killing not from ideology or pathology, but from pure selfishness, from a need for attention so consuming that human life became merely a tool for manufacturing drama. The veterans she murdered had survived war. They deserved to die peacefully, surrounded by family, after long lives. Instead, they died alone, in terror, their hearts forced into crisis by a nurse who cared more about a boyfriend than about the sacred trust of her profession. In the end, Gilbert got what she wanted: attention, but not the kind she craved. Instead of being remembered as a dedicated nurse or a romantic figure, she is remembered as exactly what she is: a callous killer who betrayed the most vulnerable, who murdered those who had served, and who did it all for the most trivial of reasons: love, or at least her twisted version of it. Patients at a small-town hospital were 42 times more likely to die when this popular nurse was on duty, yet he almost got away with it. The Angel of Death in small-town America, Clinton, Indiana, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, a tight-knit farming community of fewer than 5,000 people where the 56-bed Vermilion County Hospital served as a lifeline for residents in their times of greatest need. It was also the kind of place where people trusted their neighbors, where a friendly nurse would be welcomed into patients' rooms without suspicion, where no one would imagine that popularity and competence could mask homicidal rage. Orville Lynn Majors, born April 24, 1961, was that nurse. Colleagues described him as one of the most popular staff members at the hospital. Personable, efficient, seemingly dedicated to his work. What they didn't know was that behind the professional smile, Majors harbored a seething contempt for the elderly patients under his care, viewing them not as human beings deserving dignity and compassion, but as burdens to be eliminated. Between 1993 and 1995, the death rate at Vermilion County Hospital exploded with terrifying suddenness. Before Majors returned to work there, the facility averaged about 26 deaths per year. After his arrival, that number quadrupled to over 100 deaths annually. In a small hospital serving a small town, this should have triggered immediate alarm. Instead, the killing continued for 2 years. The mathematics of murder. The numbers, when finally analyzed, told a story so stark that chance could be ruled out entirely. When Majors was on duty, a patient died approximately every 23 hours. When he wasn't working, a death occurred roughly every 551 hours. Patients admitted to Vermilion County Hospital were 42 times more likely to die when Orville Lynn Majors was their nurse, a statistical impossibility that pointed to only one conclusion: deliberate murder on a massive scale. His method was clinical and efficient. Majors injected elderly patients with potassium chloride and epinephrine, drugs that sent their hearts into fatal arrhythmias, causing cardiac events that could be mistaken for natural deaths in a population already vulnerable due to age and illness. In the chaos of a small-town hospital with limited resources and overworked staff, these deaths initially raised few questions. The victims were old, after all. They were sick. Wasn't death simply to be expected? But death wasn't simply visiting Vermilion County Hospital at a natural rate. It was being delivered by a nurse who had decided which patients deserved to live and which were too much trouble to care for. Witnesses would later testify that Majors had said elderly people should be gassed, a chilling echo of genocidal rhetoric that revealed his view of the patients he was sworn to protect, those he deemed demanding, whiny, or disproportionately adding to his workload, became targets for elimination. The mask. Slips, the investigation that eventually exposed Majors, began with what investigators couldn't ignore: the statistical anomaly of the death rate. As authorities dug deeper, the facade of the popular, competent nurse began to crack. A former roommate came forward with damning evidence: vials of potassium chloride and epinephrine, traced back to Vermilion County Hospital, had been found in the home they shared. The drugs had no legitimate purpose outside the hospital, but they had a very clear illegitimate one. As the case built, a portrait emerged of a man who had weaponized his position of trust. The elderly patients who died under his care weren't random victims. They were people he had selected for death based on his own twisted criteria of who was worthy of continued existence. Some had complained about their care. Others had required too much attention. Still others had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Majors decided to reduce his workload through murder. The true death toll remains unknown, but investigators believe Majors killed between 100 and 130 patients during his time at Vermilion County Hospital. He was ultimately charged with 7 murders and convicted of 6 when the jury deadlocked on the 7th case. The victims whose deaths could be definitively linked to him represented only a fraction of his crimes. The cases where evidence was strongest, where the connection between Majors' presence and the fatal cardiac events was undeniable. Justice in a small town. On October 17, 1999, a jury convicted Orville Lynn Majors of 6 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 360 years in prison, 60 years for each victim, to be served consecutively. It was a symbolic recognition that even if the full scope of his crimes could never be proven in court, the magnitude of what he'd done demanded the harshest possible punishment. The Indiana State Nursing Board had already suspended his license for 5 years before criminal charges were filed, an administrative recognition that Majors should never again have access to vulnerable patients. But the suspension came far too late for the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of elderly men and women who had died at his hands. Majors maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, never offering the families of his victims the closure of a confession or an explanation beyond the hatred he'd already expressed for elderly patients. On September 24, 2017, he died in Indiana State Prison in Michigan City at the age of 56. He had served less than 2 decades of his 360-year sentence. A small town's nightmare. The Majors case shattered the sense of safety that had existed in Clinton, Indiana. In small communities, the bonds of trust run deep. Residents know their nurses, their doctors, their caregivers personally. The revelation that one of the most popular nurses at the local hospital had been systematically murdering elderly patients violated that trust at its most fundamental level. For the families who had watched their loved ones die at Vermilion County Hospital, the truth brought both answers and anguish. Elderly parents and grandparents who they'd believed had succumbed to illness or the natural decline of age had instead been murdered, their deaths hastened by a man who viewed their continued existence as an inconvenience. Grief was compounded by betrayal, and natural mourning was poisoned by the knowledge that these deaths had been preventable, that someone charged with providing care had instead delivered death. The case also demonstrated a disturbing truth. Serial killers can operate anywhere. The monster doesn't always lurk in the big city hospital or the anonymous urban medical center. Sometimes the killer is the friendly nurse in the small-town facility, the person everyone likes and trusts, the professional whose skills are valued and whose presence is welcomed. The same intimacy and trust that makes small communities strong can also create vulnerabilities, a reluctance to suspect neighbors, a slowness to recognize patterns, an assumption that evil is something that happens elsewhere. The legacy of statistics. If the Majors case has a silver lining, it lies in its demonstration of the power of statistical analysis to detect patterns invisible to individual observation. No single doctor or nurse at Vermilion County Hospital recognized what was happening. How could they, when each death seemed explainable in isolation? But when the data was examined as a whole, the truth became undeniable. The 42-fold increase in mortality during Majors' shifts was mathematically impossible to explain as coincidence. This case, along with others like it, prompted healthcare facilities to implement better statistical monitoring systems, tracking not just overall mortality rates, but patterns linked to specific staff members, shifts, and units. The goal became early detection, catching the next Orville Lynn Majors before the body count reached triple digits. But for the 100 to 130 victims Majors is believed to have killed, these reforms came too late. They were elderly people, mothers and fathers, grandmothers and grandfathers, who had lived full lives and deserved peaceful, dignified deaths. Instead, they died in terror and confusion, their hearts forced into crisis by a nurse who had decided they were too much trouble to keep alive. Orville Lynn Majors wasn't an angel of mercy. He was an angel of death, selecting his victims based on his own convenience and executing them with the tools of his profession. And he almost got away with it, would have gotten away with it, if not for investigators who looked at the numbers and recognized that in a small town in Indiana, something was very, very wrong. The angel of death, who confessed to 87 murders, was so prolific that he couldn't remember all his victims' names, the killer who couldn't stop. For 18 years, Donald Harvey moved through hospitals in Ohio and Kentucky like a shadow, leaving a trail of bodies so extensive that even he lost count. Born April 15, 1952, Harvey began working as a hospital orderly at age 18, a position that required minimal training but granted maximum access to vulnerable patients. By the time he was finally caught in 1987, he had become one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who murdered with such frequency and casual indifference that the act of killing had become as routine as checking vitals or changing bed sheets. Harvey confessed to 87 murders, though only 37 could be confirmed. The discrepancy wasn't due to investigators' skepticism. It was because Harvey himself couldn't remember all his victims. Names blurred together. Faces faded from memory. When pressed for details about specific deaths, he would shrug and offer vague recollections as if being asked to recall mundane tasks from years past rather than deliberate acts of murder. His victims ranged from middle-aged to elderly patients in the hospitals where he worked, but his killing extended beyond the facilities that employed him. He murdered neighbors who annoyed him. He killed his boyfriend's relatives. He even poisoned a neighbor's dog. Harvey didn't discriminate in his violence. If someone irritated him, inconvenienced him, or simply struck him as a suitable target, they risked becoming his next victim. A catalog of death. What distinguished Harvey from other medical murderers was the sheer variety of his methods. While most healthcare serial killers develop a signature approach, a preferred drug, a reliable technique, Harvey used whatever was convenient, whatever was at hand, whatever suited his mood. His arsenal of murder included cyanide and arsenic rat poison insulin and morphine overdoses, suffocation with pillows and plastic bags, turning off ventilators, injecting hepatitis-tainted blood and fluids, puncturing patients with coat hangers to cause fatal infections. The diversity of methods revealed something chilling about Harvey's psychology. Murder wasn't a compulsion tied to a specific ritual or technique. It was simply something he did, adaptable and opportunistic, like a craftsman selecting the right tool for the job at hand. His first victim in May 1970 was 88-year-old Logan Evans at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. Harvey was just 18 years old, barely into his first months as a hospital orderly, when he smothered the elderly patient. His motive, he would later claim, was anger. Evans had smeared feces on him during care. In Harvey's mind, this justified murder. It was a pattern that would define his killing career: perceived slights, minor annoyances, and the simple belief that he had the right to end lives that inconvenienced him. The whispers, no, one heeded. The warning signs weren't just present, they were impossible to miss. Co-workers at the hospitals where Harvey worked began calling him Kiss of Death and Angel of Death, dark jokes that contained a terrible truth. They noticed the pattern of deaths that clustered around his shifts. They observed his unusual interest in death and dying, his comfort around corpses that went beyond professional necessity. At the Cincinnati VA Medical Center, authorities found Harvey in possession of a loaded gun and occult books, discoveries that should have triggered immediate investigation and termination. Instead, he was allowed to quietly resign and move on to his next position at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, where the killing would continue. Nurses at Drake raised formal concerns to hospital administrators, reporting their suspicions about the unusual number of deaths occurring on Harvey's watch. The response was not investigation, but suppression. Administrators ordered the nurses to keep quiet. Protecting the hospital's reputation took precedence over protecting patients' lives. It was a decision that would cost dozens of people their lives. The institutional silence that enabled Harvey's killing spree reflected a broader problem in healthcare, a reluctance to believe that caregivers could be killers, and a tendency to prioritize organizational reputation over patient safety. Harvey understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly, knowing that suspicions would be dismissed, complaints would be buried, and he would be allowed to continue working and killing. The mask falls away. Harvey initially portrayed himself as an angel of mercy, claiming his murders were acts of compassion designed to end suffering. It was a narrative that some media outlets initially accepted, a story that made his crimes seem almost understandable, if not forgivable. But as investigators dug deeper and Harvey spoke more freely, the mercy-killing defense crumbled entirely. The truth was far darker. Harvey admitted that he just liked killing. The act itself brought him satisfaction, the power, the control, the god-like authority over life and death. Many of his victims weren't terminally ill or suffering. They were recovering patients, people with good prognoses, individuals who had irritated him in some minor way or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He killed because he wanted to, because he could, and because for 18 years no one stopped him. His victims outside the hospital made the mercy-killing narrative impossible to maintain. What mercy was being delivered when he poisoned his boyfriend's relatives? What suffering was being ended when he murdered neighbors or killed a pet? These weren't acts of compassion. They were the actions of a sociopath who had discovered that murder was easy, that the opportunities were endless, and that the systems meant to catch killers were woefully inadequate when the killer wore scrubs and carried a bedpan. Justice, finally. The case that finally brought Harvey down began not with hospital administrators or law enforcement, but with a journalist. WCPO investigative reporter Pat Minarkin produced a special report on suspicious deaths at Drake Memorial Hospital, bringing public attention to patterns that had been ignored or actively suppressed. The investigation that followed would expose one of the longest and deadliest serial killing sprees in American history. In August 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 murders in Ohio, receiving 3 concurrent life sentences. In November 1987, he pleaded guilty to 9 murders in Kentucky. In total, he was convicted of 37 murders and sentenced to 28 life terms. The plea deals allowed him to avoid the death penalty, a decision that undoubtedly saved his life, at least temporarily. Harvey served 30 years in prison before his death on March 30, 2017. But his death didn't come from natural causes or the state's execution chamber. At age 64, he was severely beaten by fellow inmate James Elliott at Toledo Correctional Institution. He died from his injuries 2 days after the attack. In a grim irony, the man who had spent 18 years dealing death to vulnerable, helpless victims died helpless himself, victim of the violence he had so casually inflicted on others. In a tiny 45-bed hospital, 22 patients died on her shifts, while only 1 died on all other shifts combined, the cruelest way to kill. Death Comes to Nocona, Texas, is the kind of place that embodies small-town America, a community of fewer than 3,000 people where neighbors know each other by name, and the local hospital serves as a cornerstone of civic life. Nocona General Hospital, despite its modest 45-bed capacity, had earned recognition as one of the nation's 100 best rural healthcare facilities. It was a source of pride for the community, a place where residents felt safe entrusting their care to familiar faces. Between December 2000 and February 2001, that sense of safety was shattered. In just 3 months, 22 patients died on the shifts of licensed vocational nurse Vicki Dawn Jackson. During that same period, only 1 patient died when she wasn't working. The statistical disparity was so extreme, a death every 23 hours when Jackson worked versus near zero mortality otherwise. That coincidence could be ruled out entirely. Something was happening in the halls of Nocona General Hospital, something that defied medical explanation and demanded investigation. What authorities would ultimately discover was that Vicki Dawn Jackson, born February 13, 1966, and a licensed nurse since 1989, was systematically murdering patients using one of the cruelest methods imaginable: injecting mivacurium chloride, a powerful muscle paralytic, directly into their IV lines. Conscious paralysis, the cruelest death. To understand the horror of Jackson's crimes, one must understand what mivacurium chloride does to the human body. This drug, used legitimately during surgical procedures to temporarily paralyze muscles, works by blocking the neuromuscular junction, the connection between nerves and muscles. Within seconds of injection, every voluntary muscle in the body becomes paralyzed. The victim cannot move, cannot speak, cannot even blink, but consciousness remains intact. The diaphragm, the primary muscle responsible for breathing, stops functioning. The victim experiences the sensation of suffocation, the desperate primal panic of being unable to draw breath, all while remaining fully aware of what's happening. Doctors who testified in Jackson's case described it as about the cruelest way to kill somebody. The victim drowns in air, conscious and terrified, their body frozen while their mind screams for help that cannot come. For elderly patients already struggling with illness, this death would have been particularly agonizing. Many of Jackson's victims were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, individuals whose respiratory systems were already compromised, whose bodies were weak from disease or age. The sudden onset of paralysis and respiratory failure would have been terrifying beyond measure, a nightmare from which they could not wake and could not escape. Jackson selected this particular drug with calculation. Mivacurium chloride exits the body, quickly, metabolizing rapidly and leaving little trace in post-mortem toxicology. In a small rural hospital without sophisticated monitoring systems, deaths could be attributed to natural causes: cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, complications from existing conditions. It was the perfect murder weapon, or so Jackson believed. A family betrayal. Among Jackson's victims was a death that cut particularly deep. E.E. Preacher Jackson, her own husband's 91-year-old grandfather. The man was a beloved figure in the community, a patriarch of the Jackson family, someone who should have been safest precisely because of his family connection to one of the hospital's nurses. Instead, that connection made him a target. Vicki Dawn Jackson injected her husband's grandfather with the paralyzing drug, condemning him to die in conscious terror, unable to call for help or even signal his distress as his body shut down. The betrayal was profound, not just of the patient-nurse relationship or the trust the hospital had placed in her, but of family bonds, of marriage vows, of the most basic human obligations. When the truth came to light, Jackson's husband had to reconcile two devastating realities. His grandfather had been murdered, and his wife was the killer. The family was fractured by this dual tragedy, forced to grieve not just a loved one's death, but the circumstances of that death and the person responsible for it. Not all of Jackson's victims died. Donnelly Reed survived an attempted murder, evidence that would prove crucial to the case against her. Reed's survival meant investigators had a living witness to the effects of the drug, someone who could describe the terrifying paralysis, and medical records showing the inexplicable onset of respiratory distress with no underlying cause. Reed's case helped establish the pattern and demonstrate that these weren't random medical emergencies, but deliberate acts of poisoning. The pattern emerges. Hospital administrators at Nocona General weren't blind to what was happening. The death rate spike during December 2000 through February 2001 was impossible to ignore. 22 deaths in 3 months at a facility that had previously maintained excellent patient outcomes. They began tracking the pattern, noting which shifts saw elevated mortality, which staff members were present during the suspicious deaths. The investigation took time, too much time for some victims, but the pattern became undeniable. Deaths clustered around Vicki Dawn Jackson's shifts with mathematical precision. The medication logs showed irregularities in the tracking of mivacurium chloride. Witnesses began coming forward with observations that, in isolation, had seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a damning picture. The challenge investigators faced was proving intentional murder rather than negligence or unfortunate coincidence. Mivacurium chloride's rapid metabolism made post-mortem detection difficult. Many victims had already been buried or cremated, their bodies lost to forensic examination. The case required not just medical evidence, but statistical analysis, witness testimony, and meticulous reconstruction of events from December 2000 to February 2001. A plea to avoid the truth. The legal proceedings against Vicki Dawn Jackson took years to unfold. She was ultimately charged with 10 counts of capital murder, a crime in Texas that carries the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors had a strong case: the statistical impossibility of the death pattern, the medication discrepancies, the surviving victim, and testimony from medical experts about the deliberate nature of the poisonings. On October 5, 2006, Jackson entered a plea of no contest to all 10 counts. She neither admitted nor denied guilt, but accepted the consequences: life imprisonment with 10 consecutive life terms. The plea deal meant she avoided a trial that would have publicly aired every detail of her crimes, and, perhaps most significantly, would have required her own daughter to testify against her. The decision to plead no contest rather than face trial spoke volumes. A mother willing to force her daughter to take the stand and testify about her crimes, or to spare her that trauma by accepting responsibility. Jackson chose the latter, though whether from genuine remorse or simply pragmatic calculation remains unclear. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the consecutive terms ensuring she would never be eligible for parole until 2042, when she would be 76 years old. Given the severity of her crimes and the number of victims, actual release seems unlikely, even if she lives that long. The small-town nightmare. For Nocona, Texas, the revelation of Jackson's crimes was devastating in ways unique to small communities. In large urban hospitals, staff members can be anonymous, relationships professional and distant. In a 45-bed rural facility, everyone knows everyone. The nurse caring for your mother might be your neighbor. The person administering medications might have children in the same school as your grandchildren. Vicki Dawn Jackson wasn't a stranger. She was a member of the community, someone residents had trusted with their care and their lives. She had worked at the hospital long enough to be familiar, to be accepted, to be part of the fabric of local health care. The discovery that she had been systematically murdering patients shattered the sense of safety that small-town residents depend upon. The victims, ranging in age from 62 to 100, represented the most vulnerable members of the community. They were grandmothers and grandfathers, retired farmers and longtime residents, people who had contributed to Nocona for decades and deserved to spend their final years in peace and dignity. Instead, they died in terror, paralyzed and suffocating at the hands of someone sworn to care for them. The betrayal extended beyond individual victims to the hospital itself. Nocona General had been recognized as one of the nation's best rural health care facilities, a remarkable achievement for such a modest institution. Jackson's crimes tainted that reputation, raising questions about oversight, medication control, and how a nurse could steal paralyzing drugs and use them to murder patients without being immediately detected. The systemic failures. The Jackson case highlighted vulnerabilities specific to small rural hospitals. These facilities often operate with limited resources, smaller staffs, and less sophisticated monitoring systems than their urban counterparts. Medication tracking may be less rigorous. Statistical anomalies may take longer to identify when the baseline numbers are already small. Administrators may be slower to suspect that one of their own, someone they know personally, whose family they know, could be a killer. The investigation into Jackson's crimes revealed gaps in medication inventory control. Mivacurium chloride, a controlled substance that should have been carefully tracked, had been stolen from hospital supplies without triggering immediate alarm. The systems meant to prevent medication diversion, theft by staff for personal use or criminal purposes, were inadequate to detect or prevent Jackson's crimes. This wasn't unique to Nocona General. Across the country, particularly in rural facilities, medication security often relies on trust rather than foolproof systems. When that trust is betrayed by someone like Jackson, the consequences are catastrophic. A mother's crimes, a daughter's burden. One of the most tragic aspects of the Jackson case was its impact on her daughter, who would have been called to testify against her own mother had the case gone to trial. The burden placed on children when parents commit horrific crimes is often overlooked in the focus on victims and perpetrators. Jackson's daughter would have had to take the stand, under oath, and provide testimony that could lead to her mother's execution. She would have been forced to choose between lying to protect her parent or telling the truth and potentially sending her mother to death row. The psychological toll of that position, the guilt, the conflict, the impossibility of making a choice that doesn't carry devastating consequences is almost unimaginable. By pleading no contest, Jackson spared her daughter that specific trauma, though she couldn't undo the broader damage of her crimes. Her daughter still had to live with the knowledge that her mother was a serial killer, that the woman who raised her had murdered at least 10 people, including a family member. She had to reconcile the mother she knew, or thought she knew, with the monster revealed by the investigation, the horror of mivacurium. The medical community's description of Jackson's murder method as the cruelest way to kill somebody deserves emphasis. There are many ways to take a life, but few combine conscious awareness with total helplessness in quite the way that mivacurium chloride poisoning does. Imagine being fully awake and aware as every muscle in your body stops responding to your commands. You cannot move your arms or legs. You cannot turn your head. You cannot even move your eyes to signal distress. And then your chest stops rising and falling. Your diaphragm, paralyzed like every other voluntary muscle, can no longer draw air into your lungs. You are suffocating, but you cannot gasp. You cannot fight. You cannot reach for the call button or even gesture toward it. All you can do is lie there, conscious and terrified, as the oxygen in your blood depletes and your brain begins to shut down from hypoxia. The experience would be one of pure terror, compounded by the helplessness and the knowledge that you are in a hospital surrounded by people who could save you if only you could communicate what was happening. For Jackson's victims, elderly patients, many already frightened by illness and hospitalization, this death was particularly cruel. They died alone in the most profound sense, physically surrounded by people, but unable to communicate their distress, their bodies unresponsive, even as their minds remained alert to their own dying. Life behind bars. Vicki Dawn Jackson is currently incarcerated at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas, a facility that houses female inmates serving long sentences. She has been behind bars since 2006 and won't be eligible for parole until 2042, more than 3 decades from the time of her sentencing. Her life in prison is a stark contrast to the power and control she wielded during her murder spree. As a nurse, she held life and death in her hands, deciding which patients lived and which died based on criteria known only to her. In prison, she has no such power. She is subject to the authority of correctional officers, bound by institutional rules, stripped of the professional identity that enabled her crimes. Unlike some medical murderers who maintain their innocence or claim they were motivated by mercy, Jackson has offered little public explanation for her actions. Her no-contest plea meant she never had to articulate a motive or justify her crimes. The question of why she killed at least 10 people, why she chose such a cruel method, why she murdered her husband's grandfather, remains largely unanswered. The unanswered questions. While Jackson was convicted of 10 murders, she is suspected in 20 or more deaths. The true body count may never be known. Many of her suspected victims died during the same 3-month period when the confirmed murders occurred, but lack of physical evidence, bodies already buried, toxicology samples no longer available, medical records insufficient to establish criminal liability, meant prosecutors couldn't bring charges in those cases. For the families of those suspected victims, this creates a terrible uncertainty. They know their loved one died during the period when Jackson was actively killing. They see their relative's name on the lists of suspicious deaths, but they will never receive the legal confirmation, the formal acknowledgement that their family member was murdered. They exist in a limbo between natural death and homicide, unable to fully grieve because they cannot fully know. A legacy of fear and reform. The Jackson case prompted reforms in how rural hospitals track controlled substances and monitor mortality patterns. The extreme statistical disparity that marked her killing spree, 22 deaths on her shifts versus 1 death on all other shifts combined, should have triggered immediate investigation. The fact that it took time for the pattern to be recognized and acted upon revealed gaps in oversight that needed to be addressed. Hospitals implemented better systems for tracking medication inventory, particularly for drugs that could be weaponized like mivacurium chloride. Statistical monitoring improved, with facilities looking for patterns in mortality rates tied to specific shifts or staff members. The goal was early detection, catching the next Vicki Dawn Jackson before the body count reached double digits. But for Nocona, Texas, and for the families of the 10 confirmed victims and the 20 or more suspected victims, these reforms came too late. Their loved ones died in one of the cruelest ways imaginable, at the hands of someone they trusted, in a hospital that was supposed to be one of the best in the nation at its size. The tiny 45-bed facility in a small Texas town became the site of one of the most concentrated killing sprees in medical murder history. 22 deaths in 3 months, a rate of horror that should have been impossible in a place dedicated to healing. And at the center of it all was Vicki Dawn Jackson, a trusted nurse who chose the cruelest method of murder and showed no mercy to victims who included her own husband's family. She sits in prison now, serving life sentences that will likely keep her incarcerated until she dies. But the shadow of her crimes continues to haunt Nocona, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears scrubs and a familiar smile, and by the time the pattern becomes clear, the body count is already staggering. Dialysis patients watched in horror as a vengeful nurse drew bleach into syringes and injected it into their tubes while they were still connected. Death in plain sight, April 2008, should have been just another month at the Davida Dialysis Center in Lufkin, Texas, a facility where patients with kidney failure came 3 times a week to have their blood cleaned by machine. A routine that kept them alive but tethered them to medical equipment for hours at a time. Dialysis patients are among the most vulnerable in healthcare. Immobilized during treatment, connected to machines by tubes filled with their own blood, completely dependent on the competence and compassion of the staff caring for them. That vulnerability became terror when Kimberly Clark Science, a licensed vocational nurse born November 3, 1973, began injecting bleach directly into patients' dialysis lines while they were still connected to the machines. The horror of what Science did cannot be overstated. Dialysis patients were conscious, awake, and aware, sitting in recliners for hours while their blood cycled through external filters. They watched as Science approached with syringes, watched as she injected substances into their lines, and in some cases watched as she drew those syringes from a bucket of bleach used for cleaning equipment. They saw what was happening but were powerless to stop it, trapped by their connection to machines that were keeping them alive, even as those same connections became conduits for poison. Within the span of just 28 days, April 1st through April 28, 2008, 5 patients would die and 5 others would suffer serious injuries. More than 30 patients required hospitalization during Science's 1-month killing spree. The death rate at the facility spiked so dramatically that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention launched an investigation, ultimately establishing a statistical link between Science's presence and the wave of adverse medical events, the chemistry of cruelty. To understand the agony Science inflicted, one must understand what bleach does when injected directly into the bloodstream. Household bleach contains sodium hypochlorite, a powerful oxidizing agent that, when it encounters red blood cells, triggers a process called hemolysis, the violent rupture of those cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen throughout the body. When they explode, they release their contents into the bloodstream: hemoglobin, potassium, and iron. The sudden flood of these substances overwhelms the body's ability to process them. Free iron is particularly toxic, causing oxidative damage to organs. The hemoglobin can clog the kidneys, especially problematic for dialysis patients whose kidneys were already failing. The release of potassium can trigger fatal cardiac arrhythmias. Victims of Science's bleach injections experienced excruciating chest pain as their cells ruptured and their cardiovascular systems went into crisis. Their blood, visible in the clear dialysis tubing, would sometimes turn dark or discolored as hemolysis progressed. They couldn't breathe properly. Their hearts raced or stopped. They went into cardiac arrest while still connected to the machines while other patients watched, while Science herself stood nearby. The deaths of Clara Strange, Thelma Metcalf, Garland Kelly, Cora Bryant, and Opal Few were not quick or peaceful. They were agonizing, terrifying, and wholly preventable. Murders carried out not in secret, but in a room full of witnesses by a nurse who seemed to believe she was untouchable. Witnesses to murder. What made the Science case unique in the annals of medical serial killers was the presence of eyewitnesses, not colleagues who noticed patterns after the fact, but patients who watched her commit murder in real time. Linda Hall and Lurleen Hamilton, both dialysis patients at the center, saw Science inject Marva Roan and Carolyn Reisinger with syringes she had filled from the bleach bucket. They watched as she approached the patients, watched as she connected the syringes to the IV lines, watched as she pushed the plungers and sent poison directly into the bloodstreams of people who were helpless to resist. The courage it took for Hall and Hamilton to come forward cannot be overstated. They were dialysis patients themselves, dependent on the same facility, vulnerable to the same staff, connected to the same machines. Speaking out meant potentially making themselves targets. It meant reliving the trauma of what they'd witnessed. It meant testifying in court, facing cross-examination, putting their credibility on the line. But they did it anyway. They came forward because they understood that their testimony was the only way to stop Science, the only way to ensure justice for the victims, the only way to protect future patients from the same fate. Their bravery broke the case open and ensured that Science would face accountability for her crimes. Other patients who survived Science's attacks also contributed crucial testimony. They described the sudden onset of symptoms, the chest pain, the difficulty breathing, the sense that something was terribly wrong during treatments when Science was their nurse. They provided medical records showing the unexplained adverse events. They corroborated the pattern that investigators were piecing together. A history of betrayal. Kimberly Science's crimes didn't emerge from nowhere. Her history revealed a pattern of misconduct, drug theft, and deteriorating professional behavior that should have disqualified her from working in healthcare long before she ever had the opportunity to kill. She had been fired from a hospital position for stealing drugs, a theft that indicated both addiction and a willingness to violate the most basic trust of her profession. She had failed drug tests, suggesting ongoing substance abuse that should have triggered intervention and license review. She struggled with depression, which colleagues noted, but which apparently didn't result in adequate treatment or professional oversight. In the weeks before her killing spree began, Science had been demoted at the DeVita Center, reassigned from her previous role in a move she perceived as disrespectful and humiliating. Coworkers would later describe her as upset and angry, feeling that she had been wronged by management. She expressed particular dislike for certain patients who would later die or require emergency resuscitation under her care. The demotion appears to have been the trigger that transformed simmering resentment into homicidal action. On April 1, 2008, the day the killing began, Science's computer showed searches for bleach poisoning and information about how bleach could be detected in dialysis lines. These searches occurred before her shift that day, indicating premeditation. She researched how to poison patients, then went to work and did exactly that. 2 patients died on April 1st. More would follow in the days and weeks ahead. Each death, each injury was an act of revenge, not against the specific patients, many of whom had done nothing to wrong her, but against the facility that had demoted her, against a profession that had failed to give her the respect she felt she deserved, against a world that hadn't recognized her importance. The investigation closes in. The spike in adverse events at the Lufkin DeVita Center was impossible to ignore. Within a single month, deaths and medical emergencies had reached crisis levels. The CDC became involved, conducting epidemiological analysis to identify patterns and potential causes. Investigators found the statistical link between Science's presence and the adverse events undeniable. They interviewed staff and patients, collected medical records, and began to piece together the horrifying truth. The eyewitness testimony from Hall and Hamilton provided the breakthrough, direct observation of Science drawing bleach into syringes and injecting it into patient lines. Laboratory analysis of dialysis equipment and patient blood samples revealed evidence of chlorine exposure, though the body metabolizes and eliminates bleach relatively quickly, making detection challenging. The development of chlorotyrosine testing, a method for detecting chemical signatures left by chlorine exposure, became crucial to building the forensic case against Science. Physical evidence, statistical analysis, eyewitness testimony, and Science's own computer searches all converged to create an overwhelming case. She had researched bleach poisoning, had access to bleach at the facility, had been seen drawing bleach into syringes, had been present for a statistically impossible cluster of adverse events, and had expressed animosity toward patients who subsequently died or were injured. The trial and sentence. Kimberly Science's trial began in March 2012, nearly 4 years after her crimes. The 18-day proceeding laid out the full scope of her actions: 5 murders, 5 serious injuries, and more than 30 hospitalizations during a 1-month period. Prosecutors presented the eyewitness testimony, the statistical evidence, the computer searches, and the medical records documenting the hemolysis and cardiac events consistent with bleach poisoning. The defense struggled to counter the weight of evidence. They couldn't explain away the witnesses who had seen Science draw bleach into syringes. They couldn't account for the statistical impossibility of the death cluster. They couldn't justify the computer searches for bleach poisoning occurring just before her shift on the day 2 patients died. On March 31, 2012, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges: 5 counts of capital murder and multiple counts of aggravated assault. Prosecutors had sought the death penalty, arguing that the deliberate nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the sheer number of deaths warranted the ultimate punishment. The jury disagreed, recommending life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead. Science also received 3 consecutive 20-year sentences for the assault convictions, adding 60 years to her life sentence, a symbolic recognition that while the murder convictions alone would keep her imprisoned for life, each victim deserved individual acknowledgment in her punishment. She is currently serving her sentence in a Texas Department of Criminal Justice facility, where she will remain until her death. There is no possibility of parole, no chance of release, no hope of freedom. The woman who took 5 lives and shattered dozens more will spend the rest of her days behind bars. The victims and their families. Clara Strange, Thelma Metcalf, Garland Kelly, Cora Bryant, and Opal Few came to the DeVita Dialysis Center seeking life-sustaining treatment. They were dealing with kidney failure, a chronic condition that required regular dialysis to remove toxins their bodies could no longer filter naturally. They were vulnerable, dependent on medical technology and the skill of healthcare workers to keep them alive. They trusted the facility. They trusted the staff. They trusted that the nurse connecting them to the dialysis machine would follow proper procedures, would administer medications correctly, would prioritize their safety and well-being above all else. That trust was betrayed in the most brutal way imaginable. They were murdered, not quickly or painlessly, but through a method that caused their cells to explode, their organs to fail, their hearts to stop, while they were conscious and aware of their distress. Some may have realized what was happening, that the nurse they trusted was killing them. Others may have died in confusion, wondering why their routine treatment had suddenly gone so terribly wrong. The families of the victims had to confront not just the loss of their loved ones, but the manner of their deaths. They learned that their mothers, fathers, grandparents hadn't died from complications of kidney disease, but had been murdered, deliberately poisoned by someone whose job was to care for them. The grief of natural death was compounded by the horror of homicide. The 5 patients who survived Science's attacks carried both physical and psychological scars. They endured the agony of bleach coursing through their veins, the terror of going into medical crisis while connected to dialysis machines, and the trauma of learning that their nurse had been trying to kill them. Some required hospitalization and intensive treatment to survive. All had to continue dialysis treatment, possibly at the same facility where they'd been attacked, living with the fear that came from knowing how vulnerable they were. Infamous selfies with dead patients made her a media sensation, but questionable statistics and weak evidence led to her eventual acquittal. The photographs that shocked the world. When investigators examined Daniela Poggiali's phone in 2014, they found images that instantly made her an international symbol of medical depravity. Photographs of the 42-year-old Italian nurse posing next to apparently deceased patients, giving thumbs-up signs, smiling at the camera as if she were a tourist at a monument, rather than a healthcare worker standing beside the dead. The photos went viral. Media outlets around the world published them with headlines declaring Poggiali a killer nurse, a selfie murderer, an angel of death. The images seemed to provide irrefutable evidence of her callousness, her contempt for patients, her fundamentally broken moral compass. How could anyone innocent take such photographs? What kind of person smiles next to corpses? The answer to those questions would prove far more complicated than the initial media frenzy suggested. What began as an apparently straightforward case of a serial killer nurse would evolve into one of the most controversial medical murder prosecutions in recent history. A case study in how statistical analysis, media sensationalism, and circumstantial evidence can create a narrative of guilt that ultimately crumbles under scrutiny. The accusations Daniela Poggiali worked as a nurse at Umberto Ware Hospital in Lugo di Romagna, a town in northern Italy. Colleagues described her as tireless but also cynical and vindictive, someone who worked hard but whose attitude toward patients and co-workers raised concerns. She had a reputation for dark humor, for expressing frustration with difficult patients, and for behavior that seemed unprofessional, if not outright disturbing. Prosecutors initially accused her of murdering up to 96 patients between 2012 and 2014. She was specifically charged with the murders of Rosa Calderoni, 78, and Massimo Montanari, 94, along with involvement in numerous other suspicious deaths. The alleged method, injecting annoying patients, those she found demanding, difficult, or tiresome, with potassium chloride to induce fatal cardiac arrest. The statistical case against her appeared damning. During a 3-month period when Poggiali worked, 38 of 86 patients died, compared to an average of 10 deaths for her colleagues during similar time frames. Mortality rates were reported to be 3 to 5 times higher during her shifts than when she wasn't working. The numbers seemed to tell a clear story. Patients were dying at impossible rates when Daniela Poggiali was their nurse. Colleagues reported that she had expressed dislike for certain patients who later died under her care. She allegedly gave laxatives to patients before the end of her shift specifically to create problems for incoming nurses, a petty act of vindictiveness that suggested contempt for both patients and coworkers. And then there were those photographs, the selfies with the dead that seemed to document her pride in her crimes. In 2016, Poggiali was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Italian media and international outlets reported the conviction as justice served. Another medical serial killer finally stopped. The case seemed closed. The unraveling. But the case against Daniela Poggiali began to fall apart almost immediately upon appeal. Defense attorneys and independent experts started examining the evidence with the scrutiny it had not received during the initial investigation and trial. What they found raised profound questions about whether Poggiali had been convicted not based on evidence of actual crimes, but on a combination of statistical anomalies, character judgments, and public outrage over disturbing photographs. The statistical analysis, the foundation of the prosecution's case, proved deeply flawed. The mortality rates that had seemed so damning turned out to be based on incomplete data and questionable methodology. When properly contextualized, the death rates during Poggiali's shifts were not as dramatically different from her colleagues as initially reported. The comparison groups were not equivalent. The statistical significance that had seemed so clear dissolved under proper analysis. Moreover, the patients who died during Poggiali's shifts were generally older, sicker, and closer to death than average patients at the facility. She often worked night shifts and in units with the most critically ill patients, factors that would naturally result in higher mortality rates even with competent, compassionate care. The statistics had not adequately controlled for these confounding variables. The forensic evidence proved even more problematic. Potassium chloride, the alleged murder weapon, is difficult to detect post-mortem because potassium naturally increases in the body after death as cells break down. The toxicology testing performed in the case was questioned by independent experts who noted methodological flaws and the absence of definitive proof that victims had been injected with exogenous potassium. In several cases, the bodies had been embalmed or buried before proper forensic examination could be conducted, destroying potential evidence and making it impossible to definitively determine cause of death. The prosecution's case relied heavily on retrospective interpretation of medical records and statistical correlations rather than direct physical evidence of poisoning. The selfies reconsidered. What about those photographs, the images that had seemed to provide such damning evidence of Poggiali's depravity? Upon closer examination, even these became more ambiguous than they initially appeared. Defense attorneys argued that the photos were examples of dark humor common among healthcare workers who deal regularly with death, a psychological coping mechanism rather than evidence of homicidal intent. Medical professionals, particularly those in intensive care and emergency settings, sometimes develop gallows humor as a way of processing the emotional toll of their work. The photographs, while deeply inappropriate and offensive to many, did not necessarily prove that Poggiali had killed anyone. Furthermore, some of the patients in the photographs were later determined to have been alive at the time the pictures were taken. Not corpses, but sleeping or unconscious patients, which made the photos disturbing examples of boundary violations and unprofessional conduct, but not documentation of murder. This context didn't excuse the photographs or make them appropriate. Healthcare professionals have a duty to maintain patient dignity, and posing for selfies with patients, whether alive, dying, or deceased, represents a profound violation of that duty. But disturbing behavior and criminal conduct are not the same thing, and the photographs that had seemed like smoking gun evidence of a killer's pride in her work became, upon examination, something far more ambiguous. The appeals and acquittal. In 2017, an appeals court cleared Poggiali of the murder charges, citing insufficient evidence. But Italian prosecutors appealed that acquittal, resulting in further retrials and years of legal proceedings that kept Poggiali in a state of limbo, neither definitively convicted nor fully exonerated. Finally, in October 2021, a Bologna appeals court acquitted Daniela Poggiali of all charges. The court found that the statistical evidence was insufficient to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt and that the forensic evidence contained critical flaws. After 7 years of investigation, prosecution, conviction, appeal, and retrial, the Italian judicial system concluded that the case against her could not be sustained. The acquittal did not declare Poggiali innocent. It established that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt to the standard required for criminal conviction. This is a crucial distinction. Some observers believe the acquittal represents justice for a wrongfully accused woman. Others believe it represents the failure of the legal system to hold a serial killer accountable due to forensic and investigative shortcomings. The wrongful conviction question. The Poggiali case bears uncomfortable similarities to other controversial medical murder prosecutions where convictions were based primarily on statistical analysis and later overturned or questioned. The most notable parallel is the case of Lucia de Burke, a Dutch nurse convicted in 2003 of murdering patients based largely on statistical evidence showing elevated mortality rates during her shifts. De Burke served 6 years in prison before her conviction was overturned in 2010 when independent experts demonstrated that the statistical analysis used to convict her was fundamentally flawed. The impossibly high mortality rate during her shifts turned out to be explainable by proper statistical methods that accounted for the types of patients she treated and the units where she worked. The case became a landmark example of how statistical reasoning can go catastrophically wrong in criminal prosecutions. The Poggiali case raises the same concerns. Were the initial statistics misleading? Did investigators and prosecutors suffer from confirmation bias, interpreting ambiguous evidence as proof of guilt once they believed they had identified a serial killer? Did the shocking selfies create such public outrage that a fair evaluation of the evidence became impossible? More recently, comparisons have been drawn between Poggiali's case and that of Lucy Letby, the British neonatal nurse convicted in 2023 of murdering multiple infants. Some statisticians and legal experts have raised questions about whether Letby's conviction, like Poggiali's initial conviction, relied too heavily on statistical correlations and too little on direct forensic evidence. These experts worry that the same pattern of flawed statistical reasoning that led to wrongful convictions in the de Burke and potentially the Poggiali cases may be repeating itself. The complexity of medical murder investigations. The Poggiali case highlights the extraordinary difficulty of investigating and prosecuting medical serial killers when direct evidence is lacking. Unlike conventional murders where there's typically a clear cause of death and physical evidence, healthcare serial killings often involve vulnerable victims, elderly or seriously ill patients whose deaths can be attributed to natural causes without raising immediate suspicion. Plausible deniability. Medical settings involve legitimate administration of powerful drugs, making it difficult to distinguish murder from medical error or natural deterioration. Delayed detection. Patterns may only become apparent after multiple deaths, by which time forensic evidence has been lost through burial, cremation, or the passage of time. Statistical ambiguity. Healthcare workers who care for sicker patients or work in higher acuity settings will naturally see more deaths, making statistical analysis complex and prone to errors if not properly controlled for confounding variables. These challenges mean that some medical serial killers may escape detection entirely, while others, potentially innocent individuals like Lucia de Burke and possibly Daniela Poggiali, may be wrongfully accused and convicted. What we know and don't know. What can be said with certainty about Daniela Poggiali? What we know: she took deeply inappropriate photographs with patients. She exhibited unprofessional behavior that her colleagues found concerning. She expressed frustration with difficult patients in ways that suggested lack of empathy. Mortality rates were elevated during her shifts, though the significance of this elevation remains disputed. What we don't know: whether she actually killed anyone, whether the statistical anomalies reflected serial murder or simply the natural variation of who lives and dies in a hospital, combined with Poggiali working with sicker patients. Whether the disturbing photographs documented pride in murder or simply reflected very poor judgment and dark humor. The Italian judicial system ultimately concluded that the prosecution could not prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. This leaves us in the uncomfortable position of being unable to say definitively whether Poggiali is a serial killer who escaped justice due to forensic limitations or a difficult person whose inappropriate behavior and statistical bad luck resulted in wrongful accusation and years of imprisonment. Scandinavia's deadliest serial killer may have murdered 138 patients, but served only 12 years because Norwegian law had no death penalty or life without parole. The man who got away with murder. Arnfinn Nesset is alive today, living somewhere in Norway under an assumed name. He is approximately 88 years old, free to walk the streets, shop in stores, and live out his remaining years in relative anonymity. This might seem unremarkable except for one fact. Nesset is believed to be responsible for as many as 138 murders, making him potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. He was convicted of killing 22 elderly patients and confessed at various times to as many as 30. Yet he served only 12 years in prison before being released in 2004 for good behavior. For families of his victims and for those who believe in proportional justice, this reality is almost incomprehensible. How can someone who murdered dozens, possibly more than 100, vulnerable elderly people walk free after little more than a decade behind bars? The answer lies in the Norwegian justice system's fundamentally different philosophy about punishment, rehabilitation, and the purpose of imprisonment. The Nesset case forces us to confront profound questions about justice, mercy, and whether some crimes are simply too heinous to ever warrant freedom. The nursing home director Arnfinn Nesset was born October 25, 1936, out of wedlock, a circumstance that carried significant social stigma in Norway at the time. Raised by a single mother in difficult circumstances, he nevertheless pursued education and became a registered nurse, eventually advancing to the position of nursing home director at Orkdal Valley Geriatric Nursing Home, which he assumed in 1977. By all outward appearances, Nesset was a respected professional. He managed a facility caring for the elderly, oversaw staff, and made decisions about patient care. Colleagues described him as competent and dedicated. Residents' families trusted him with their most vulnerable loved ones. Nothing in his public persona suggested that he was systematically murdering the people under his care. But between May 1977 and November 1980, a span of just over 3 years, something horrifying was happening at Orkdal Valley. Patients were dying at rates that exceeded statistical norms. The deaths were attributed to the natural progression of age and illness, as deaths in geriatric facilities often are. No one suspected that the nursing home director was deliberately poisoning residents with a powerful muscle relaxant he had ordered in bulk under the pretense of using it for rat control. The perfect murder weapon. Nesset's weapon of choice was Curacete, a trade name for succinylmethonium chloride, the same class of drug, a neuromuscular blocking agent, that other medical murderers have used to paralyze and kill. When administered without proper respiratory support, these drugs cause death by suffocation. The victim remains conscious while every muscle in their body, including the diaphragm, becomes paralyzed. They cannot breathe, cannot move, cannot call for help. They die in terror and agony, fully aware of what is happening, but completely unable to resist. Nesset purchased large quantities of Curacete, explaining to suppliers that he needed it for rat poison, a plausible cover story that no one questioned initially. He then administered the drug to patients either through injection or by mixing it into their food. The elderly residents of Orkdal Valley, many of whom were already suffering from various medical conditions, would have had little ability to resist or even recognize that they were being poisoned. The drug's effects would have mimicked respiratory distress, which could easily be attributed to pneumonia, heart failure, or other conditions common in geriatric populations. By the time Nesset's crimes came to light, all of his confirmed victims had been cremated, destroying any forensic evidence that might have definitively proven poisoning. This forced prosecutors to build their case through witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and statistical analysis rather than direct toxicological proof. The investigation begins. The case broke in early 1981 when a local journalist noticed something suspicious. Mortality rates at Orkdal Valley Geriatric Nursing Home had spiked dramatically, and the facility had been receiving unusually large shipments of Curacete. The journalist's curiosity triggered a police investigation that would eventually expose one of Scandinavia's most horrific serial killings. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Nesset had ordered quantities of Curacete far exceeding what could plausibly be needed for pest control. They interviewed staff members who described unusual circumstances surrounding patient deaths. They examined medical records and death certificates. And they began to suspect that the respected nursing home director had been systematically murdering the elderly people under his care. The challenge investigators faced was immense. With all bodies cremated, there was no physical evidence of poisoning. They had to rely on reconstructing events through witness testimony, tracking drug orders, analyzing mortality statistics, and documenting suspicious patterns. The case required painstaking work to build a prosecution that could succeed without the kind of forensic evidence typically needed to prove murder. During questioning, Nesset made partial confessions, at one point admitting to between 27 and 30 murders. However, he later retracted these confessions before trial, claiming they had been coerced or that he had been confused. This pattern of confession and retraction made the legal proceedings even more complex and contested. The trial and sentence. Arnfinn Nesset's trial began in 1982 and lasted 5 months. An extraordinarily long proceeding by Norwegian standards. Prosecutors called 123 witnesses to establish the pattern of deaths, the acquisition and use of Curacete, and the circumstances suggesting deliberate murder rather than natural causes or medical negligence. 4 psychiatrists examined Nesset and declared him legally sane, an important finding because it meant he would face criminal punishment rather than psychiatric commitment. He was not insane, not suffering from delusions or cognitive impairment that prevented him from understanding his actions. He was a competent adult who had chosen to systematically murder vulnerable elderly people. On March 11, 1983, the court convicted Nesset of 22 murders and 1 attempted murder, representing only a fraction of the deaths he may have caused, but the cases where prosecutors felt the evidence was strongest despite the absence of physical forensic proof. 7 days later, on March 18, 1983, he was sentenced to the maximum penalty available under Norwegian law, 21 years in prison plus 10 years of preventive detention. Under Norway's legal system, this was the harshest punishment possible. Norway has no death penalty and, at the time, no provision for true life imprisonment without the possibility of release. The sentence shocked many observers, particularly those from countries with different justice systems. 21 years for 22 murders, less than a year per victim. Even accounting for the additional preventive detention, the sentence seemed grossly disproportionate to the crimes. How could this be considered justice? Convicted of insulin murders through circumstantial evidence, this Scottish nurse's case may be one of Britain's worst miscarriages of justice. The prediction that became evidence at approximately 1:00 a.m. on November 8, 2002, Colin Norris, a nurse working the night shift at Leeds General Infirmary, made a statement to a colleague that would eventually help send him to prison for murder. Speaking about Ethel Hall, an 86-year-old patient recovering from hip surgery, Norris said that he predicted she would die during the shift and that it would happen around 5:15 a.m. At 5:12 a.m., within 3 minutes of his prediction, Ethel Hall suffered a catastrophic hypoglycemic episode that left her comatose. She died 3 months later without regaining consciousness. To prosecutors and the jury that would eventually convict him, this prediction seemed damning, evidence of foreknowledge that could only come from someone planning to cause the very crisis he predicted. How could Norris have known the exact time unless he intended to cause it? The prediction became the centerpiece of the case against him, a piece of circumstantial evidence that seemed to transform suspicion into certainty. But there was another possible explanation, one that wouldn't emerge clearly until years later. Norris, like many experienced nurses, may have been making an educated clinical observation about a patient whose condition was deteriorating. He may have genuinely believed, based on his assessment of Hall's status, that she would likely die during the shift. The fact that the timing was so precise might have been coincidence, or it might reflect a nurse's developed intuition about patient trajectories that, while often accurate, doesn't indicate criminal foreknowledge. This ambiguity, between foreknowledge suggesting guilt and clinical predictions suggesting innocence, captures the essential problem with the Colin Norris case. Nearly everything presented as evidence of murder can also be interpreted as evidence of a skilled nurse working in challenging circumstances, a difficult personality making an unfortunate prediction, and a series of tragic but ultimately natural medical events. The nurse with a difficult personality. Colin Campbell. Norris was born February 12, 1976, in Glasgow, Scotland. He pursued nursing as a career and eventually took positions at Leeds General Infirmary and St. James's Hospital in Leeds, England, working primarily on orthopedic wards caring for elderly patients recovering from hip fractures and joint replacements. By multiple accounts, Norris was not an easy colleague. He was described as aggressive, quick to anger, and possessed of a difficult personality that created friction with coworkers. He could be abrasive and dismissive. He expressed frustration with patients and the demands of his work. These character traits would later be presented by prosecutors as evidence of the kind of person capable of murdering patients, though critics would note that difficult personalities are common in high-stress medical professions and don't typically correlate with serial murder. More significantly for the later case against him, Norris had been taught by a personal tutor about the case of Jessie McTavish, a Scottish nurse convicted in 1974 of using insulin to murder patients. McTavish's conviction was later overturned when medical evidence demonstrated that the supposed insulin murders were likely natural deaths, misinterpreted through flawed forensic science. Norris also attended lectures on diabetes treatment, giving him knowledge of how insulin works and how it could theoretically be weaponized. Prosecutors would argue that this education provided Norris with both motive and method, that learning about McTavish's case gave him the idea to kill using insulin. and that his diabetes education taught him how to do it. Defense attorneys would counter that this education was part of standard nursing curriculum, that thousands of nurses learned the same information without becoming serial killers, and that using education as evidence of intent was circular reasoning. The alleged victims, Colin Norris, was ultimately convicted of murdering 4 elderly women and attempting to murder a 5th. Doris Ludlam, 80, died in June 2002 after suffering hypoglycemic episodes. No physical evidence of insulin injection found. Bridget Burke, 88, died in July 2002 after hypoglycemic episodes. No physical evidence of insulin injection found. Irene Crooks, 79, died in October 2002 after hypoglycemic episodes. No physical evidence of insulin injection found. Ethel Hall, 86, suffered catastrophic hypoglycemic episode in November 2002 that left her comatose, died 3 months later. Laboratory testing showed elevated C-peptide levels suggesting possible exogenous insulin administration, the only case with any laboratory evidence. Vera Wilby, 90, survived hypoglycemic episodes in October 2002. No physical evidence of insulin injection found. All 5 women were elderly, non-diabetic patients recovering from orthopedic surgeries on wards where Norris worked. All experienced unexplained episodes of hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, and Norris was present on duty during each of the incidents. This pattern, the common denominator of Norris's presence, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. When combined with his personality, his education about insulin murders, his prediction about Ethel Hall's death, and testimony from an ex-partner claiming he had practiced giving insulin injections to his cat, prosecutors argued that the only reasonable conclusion was murder. The medical evidence, or lack thereof. The case against Colin Norris faced a significant problem from the outset. There was almost no physical evidence. In 4 of the 5 cases, no laboratory testing had been done to confirm that insulin had been administered. The patients had experienced hypoglycemia, but hypoglycemia can occur for many reasons unrelated to insulin injection. Only in Ethel Hall's case was there laboratory evidence, and even this was contested. Testing showed elevated C-peptide levels, which can suggest exogenous, externally administered insulin. But C-peptide testing is complex, and defense experts argued that the results could be explained by other factors including the timing of testing, Hall's medical condition, and laboratory variability. There was no evidence of injection sites, no marks, bruises, or physical signs that anyone had injected these patients with anything. There were no vials of insulin found in Norris's possession. There was no testimony from anyone who had seen him preparing or administering unauthorized injections. The entire case was circumstantial, built on statistical correlation. Norris was present during all 5 incidents. Character evidence, his difficult personality and expressions of frustration with patients. Educational background, his knowledge of insulin and the McTavish case. The prediction, his statement about Ethel Hall's anticipated death time. Ex-partner testimony, claims about practicing on his cat. Expert medical opinion, testimony that hypoglycemia in non-diabetic elderly patients is vanishingly rare. This last point, the expert medical testimony about the rarity of hypoglycemia, was perhaps the most crucial element. Prosecutors presented experts who testified that unexplained hypoglycemia in non-diabetic patients was so rare as to be essentially impossible through natural causes. If these patients experienced hypoglycemia, the experts argued, someone must have given them insulin. And since Norris was always present, he must have been the one doing it. The defense presented contrary expert testimony, but the jury found the prosecution's experts more persuasive. On March 3, 2008, after a 5-month trial, Colin Norris was convicted by majority verdict, not unanimous, of 4 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. The seeds of doubt. Almost immediately, questions began to emerge about the conviction's soundness. Medical professionals, forensic experts, and legal scholars reviewed the case and identified troubling issues. The statistical evidence was weak. Being present during incidents doesn't prove causation, especially when those incidents might not have been murders at all. Nurses work specific shifts and care for specific patients, creating natural correlations that don't indicate guilt. The medical testimony was potentially flawed. The claim that hypoglycemia is vanishingly rare in non-diabetic elderly patients was based on limited data and may not have reflected actual clinical reality in hospital populations. The physical evidence was absent. No insulin, no injection marks, no witnesses. Just the assertion that hypoglycemia must mean insulin injection because it's supposedly rare otherwise. The character evidence was prejudicial. Difficult personalities don't make people murderers, and allowing personality traits to substitute for evidence of actual crimes is dangerous. Alternative explanations existed. Multiple medical conditions and medications can cause hypoglycemia in elderly hospitalized patients, but these were not adequately explored. In February 2021, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC, the UK body responsible for investigating potential miscarriages of justice, referred Norris's conviction to the Court of Appeal. The CCRC's decision reflected mounting concern that the conviction might be unsafe, based on both the weakness of the original evidence and new medical understanding that had emerged since the trial. The medical science evolves. The critical development that transformed the Norris case from seemingly solid conviction to probable wrongful imprisonment was new research on hypoglycemia in hospitalized elderly patients. Studies published after Norris's conviction demonstrated that spontaneous hypoglycemia, low blood sugar occurring without insulin administration, is far more common than the expert witnesses at his trial had testified. Research now shows that hypoglycemia occurs in approximately 5 to 10% of elderly, sick, hospitalized patients, particularly those who are undernourished, have recently undergone surgery, or are experiencing acute illness. This is not vanishingly rare, it's relatively common. The foundational medical premise of the prosecution's case, that these hypoglycemic episodes were so unusual they must represent murder, was simply wrong. This revelation transformed the interpretation of the evidence. If hypoglycemia is common in the exact patient population Norris was treating, elderly, post-surgical, hospitalized, then the occurrence of 5 such cases over several months doesn't necessarily indicate murder. It might simply reflect the natural medical realities of caring for vulnerable patients. During the May 2025 appeal hearing, medical experts presented this new evidence to the court. They explained that the understanding of hypoglycemia in 2008, when Norris was tried, was incomplete. The experts who testified at his trial were not lying or being deliberately misleading. They were reflecting the medical consensus of that time, but that consensus was wrong based on insufficient data and inadequate understanding of metabolic complications in hospitalized geriatric populations. The prediction reconsidered. The prediction about Ethel Hall's death, seemingly damning evidence of foreknowledge, also looks different in light of new medical understanding. If hypoglycemia is relatively common in patients like Hall, and if experienced nurses develop intuition about which patients are deteriorating, then Norris's prediction might have been clinical judgment rather than criminal foreknowledge. Nurses who work extensively with particular patient populations often develop pattern recognition that allows them to anticipate deterioration. They notice subtle changes in vital signs, responsiveness, skin color, breathing patterns, indicators that might not yet meet clinical criteria for emergency intervention, but that experience teaches often precede crises. If Norris had observed signs that Hall was declining, his prediction might have reflected genuine nursing assessment. The precision of the timing, predicting 5:15 a.m. and being off by only 3 minutes, might have been coincidence, or it might reflect unconscious integration of multiple subtle cues that allowed remarkably accurate prediction. This doesn't prove innocence, but it does demonstrate that what seemed like smoking gun evidence of guilt can be reinterpreted as evidence of competent nursing when the medical context is properly understood. The prediction can support two completely opposite narratives, and determining which narrative is correct requires independent evidence that was largely absent from the Norris case. The cat testimony. One of the more bizarre elements of the prosecution's case was testimony from Norris's ex-partner, who claimed that Norris had practiced giving insulin injections to his cat before the alleged patient attacks. This testimony was intended to establish premeditation and method, that Norris had literally practiced his murder technique on an animal before using it on humans. But the cat testimony was never independently verified. There was no veterinary record of the cat receiving insulin. No witnesses besides the ex-partner corroborated the story, and the relationship between Norris and this ex-partner had ended badly, raising questions about potential bias or motivation to embellish or fabricate damaging information. Using uncorroborated testimony from an ex-partner with potential bias as evidence in a murder trial is problematic under the best circumstances. When that testimony is combined with weak forensic evidence and flawed medical premises, it becomes even more concerning. Yet this testimony was presented to the jury as further proof of Norris's guilt, contributing to the conviction that may now be overturned. Comparing cases, Lucia DeBurke and Lucy Letby. The Colin Norris case bears uncomfortable similarities to other controversial medical murder prosecutions, particularly the case of Lucia DeBurke in the Netherlands. DeBurke was a Dutch nurse convicted in 2003 of murdering patients based primarily on statistical evidence showing elevated mortality rates during her shifts. She served 6 years in prison before her conviction was overturned in 2010, when independent statisticians and medical experts demonstrated that the statistical analysis used to convict her was fundamentally flawed. The impossibly high mortality rates turned out to be explainable through proper statistical methods and understanding of the patient population she treated. The parallels to Norris are striking. Statistical correlation presented as proof of causation. Difficult personality treated as evidence of murderous intent, absence of direct physical evidence, and medical expert testimony that later proved incorrect or misleading. The DeBurke case is now recognized as one of the Netherlands' worst miscarriages of justice, and many experts see similar warning signs in the Norris case. More recently, comparisons have been drawn between Norris and Lucy Letby, the British neonatal nurse convicted in 2023 of murdering multiple infants. Some statisticians, medical experts, and legal scholars have raised concerns about the Letby conviction, noting similarities to both the DeBurke and Norris cases. Heavy reliance on statistical correlation, absence of definitive physical evidence, and medical complexity that may have been misunderstood or oversimplified by prosecutors and juries. These comparisons don't prove Norris's innocence, or Letby's for that matter, but they highlight a pattern in medical murder prosecutions. The difficulty of distinguishing genuine serial killing from statistical anomalies and natural medical events, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations who have high baseline mortality rates. They demonstrate how confirmation bias can lead investigators and prosecutors to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting guilt once they've identified a suspect. The psychology of wrongful conviction. If Colin Norris is innocent, and the mounting evidence suggests he may well be, how did he end up convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to 30 years in prison? The answer lies in understanding how wrongful convictions occur, particularly in complex medical cases. Confirmation bias. Once investigators identified Norris as a suspect, they interpreted all subsequent evidence as supporting guilt rather than objectively evaluating alternative explanations. Expert testimony deference. Juries tend to trust expert witnesses, particularly medical experts, even when those experts are presenting opinions based on incomplete or incorrect scientific understanding. Character evidence. Norris's difficult personality made him unsympathetic and easier to cast as a villain, even though personality traits don't indicate criminality. Statistical misunderstanding. Both prosecutors and jurors struggle to properly evaluate the statistical evidence, mistaking correlation for causation and failing to account for confounding variables. Absence of alternative narrative. The defense struggled to present a compelling alternative explanation for the hypoglycemic episodes, making murder seem like the only explanation, even though natural causes were actually quite plausible. Emotional impact. The deaths of elderly patients are tragic, and juries naturally want to hold someone accountable. In the absence of clear alternative explanations, blaming the nurse who was present can feel like achieving justice. These factors combine to create cases where innocent people can be convicted despite weak evidence. The system doesn't intend to convict the innocent, but cognitive biases, limited understanding, and the human desire for accountability can produce miscarriages of justice even when everyone involved is acting in good faith. Life behind bars. Colin Norris has been incarcerated at HMP Franklin in County Durham since his conviction in 2008. He has consistently maintained his innocence, refusing to admit guilt or express remorse for crimes he insists he didn't commit. This insistence on innocence has likely worked against him in prison. In the UK correctional system, expressing remorse and engaging with rehabilitation programs related to one's offenses can lead to earlier parole consideration. By maintaining innocence, Norris effectively ensures he'll serve his full minimum term, 30 years, before even being considered for release. But for someone who is actually innocent, expressing false remorse for crimes they didn't commit is psychologically and morally untenable. Norris faces an impossible choice: maintain his integrity and insist on innocence at the cost of any hope of early release, or confess to murders he didn't commit in hopes of eventually earning parole. He has now spent over 17 years in prison, more than a decade and a half of his life lost to incarceration for crimes that he may not have committed based on evidence that is increasingly recognized as insufficient. If his conviction is overturned, those years cannot be returned to him. The wrongful conviction will have stolen nearly 2 decades of his life. The appeal and what comes next. The May 2025 appeal hearing represented a critical moment in Norris's fight for exoneration. His legal team presented the new medical evidence showing that hypoglycemia is far more common in elderly hospitalized patients than the expert witnesses at his trial testified. They argued that the foundational premise of his conviction, that the hypoglycemic episodes were so rare they must have been caused by insulin injection, was scientifically incorrect. The appeal court must now decide whether this new evidence renders the conviction unsafe. This is a different question than determining innocence. The court doesn't necessarily have to conclude that Norris is innocent, only that the evidence presented at trial was insufficient or flawed enough that the conviction cannot be considered reliable. Several outcomes are possible. Conviction to be overturned. The court could conclude that the new medical evidence fundamentally undermines the original conviction, order Norris released, and potentially order a retrial, though given the weakness of evidence and passage of time, retrial seems unlikely. Conviction upheld. The court could decide that even with new medical understanding, there was sufficient evidence to support conviction when considering all factors including the prediction, character evidence, and statistical correlation. Partial relief. The court might overturn some convictions while upholding others, perhaps concluding that Ethel Hall's case, the only one with any laboratory evidence, differs from the others. As of the writing of this case study, the appeal court has not yet issued its final ruling. Legal observers who have followed the case closely generally expect the conviction to be overturned, but the outcome remains uncertain. History's first documented angel of death nurse confessed to 33 murders, claiming it was sexually thrilling to watch patients die in her arms, the woman who wanted to be history's greatest killer. In the summer of 1901, when investigators finally uncovered the truth about Jane Toppin, she made a statement that still chills more than a century later. Her ambition in life, she explained matter-of-factly, was to have killed more people helpless under my power, than any other man or woman who ever lived. She very nearly achieved that goal. Born Honora Kelly in Boston in 1854, the woman who would become known as Jolly Jane spent decades moving through hospitals and private homes in Massachusetts, murdering patients, employers, friends, and even her own foster sister. She confessed to 33 murders, though the actual count is believed to be higher, perhaps significantly higher, given her lengthy nursing career and the limited forensic capabilities of the late 19th century to detect poisoning. But what made Jane Toppin truly extraordinary and truly horrifying wasn't just the body count. It was her motivation and her method. Unlike poisoners who killed for inheritance or nurses who claimed to be ending suffering, Toppin killed for sexual pleasure. She would inject patients with morphine and atropine, carefully calibrating doses to bring them to the edge of death, then climb into bed with them, holding them close as they died. She described experiencing sexual arousal from this intimate control over life and death, from the power of deciding who would live and who would die, from the sensation of feeling someone's life slip away in her arms. This combination, medical access, poisoning expertise, sexual motivation, and an explicit ambition to be history's most prolific killer, made Jane Toppin the prototype for what would later be recognized as angel of death syndrome in healthcare settings. She established a pattern that would be repeated, with variations, by dozens of medical murderers over the following century. From abandoned child to Jolly Jane, Jane Toppin's early life was marked by abandonment, instability, and trauma that would shape her psychology in ways that became evident only after her crimes were discovered. Born Honora Kelly, she was the daughter of Irish immigrants. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Honora was young, and her father, described as abusive and mentally unstable, gave her and her sister to the Boston Female Asylum, an orphanage, when Honora was just 6 years old. She was eventually placed as an indentured servant with the Toppin family in Lowell, Massachusetts. While the Toppins gave her their surname, they never formally adopted her, maintaining a distinction that reportedly stung throughout her life. She was neither fully family nor merely a servant, occupying an ambiguous position that may have contributed to her later difficulties forming healthy attachments and relationships. As a young woman, Honora Jane Toppin trained as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts, beginning her career in 1885. She earned the nickname Jolly Jane for her cheerful demeanor, her apparent dedication to patients, and her habit of bringing sweets and treats to those under her care. Doctors, nurses, and patients alike found her pleasant, competent, and seemingly devoted to the healing profession. But behind the cheerful facade, something far darker was developing. Toppin had discovered that she enjoyed the power inherent in medical care, the authority over vulnerable people, the access to dangerous drugs, and the opportunity to experiment with controlling life and death. She began using patients as subjects for her experiments, administering various combinations of morphine and atropine to observe their effects. The experiments begin. Toppin's murders weren't impulsive acts of rage or mercy killings to end suffering. They were deliberate experiments in controlling human physiology, carried out with clinical precision and escalating boldness. She would select patients, initially choosing those whose deaths would be least likely to raise suspicion: the elderly, the very ill, those already expected to die, and begin her experiments. She would inject them with morphine to depress their respiratory and cardiovascular systems, then use atropine, which has the opposite effect, to stimulate them. By carefully varying doses and combinations, she could bring patients to the brink of death, revive them, and repeat the process. This wasn't about ending suffering or even primarily about causing death. It was about control, about playing God, about the sexual and psychological gratification she derived from having absolute power over another person's existence. She described feeling aroused by watching patients struggle between life and death, by knowing that she alone determined the outcome. When she finally decided to let them die, she would often climb into the hospital bed beside them, holding them close as their systems shut down from the drug overdoses. This physical intimacy with dying, the sensation of feeling a body grow cold in her arms, the power of being the last thing someone experienced before death, was the culmination of what she found sexually and psychologically thrilling about the murders. Hospital staff noticed nothing suspicious. Deaths of already ill patients were expected. The causes, respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, were consistent with natural progression of disease. There was no reason to suspect that the cheerful, dedicated nurse was systematically murdering the people under her care. From hospital to private practice in 1890, Toppin was fired from Cambridge Hospital, though not for murder. Administrators had discovered she was using morphine herself, stealing small amounts from hospital supplies to feed an addiction she'd developed. This dismissal was handled quietly, without criminal charges or reporting to authorities, in keeping with the era's tendency to avoid scandal even at the cost of public safety. Rather than ending her nursing career, the dismissal simply pushed Toppin into private practice. She began taking positions as a private duty nurse, caring for patients in their homes, a role that gave her even greater freedom and less oversight than hospital nursing had provided. It was during this phase of her career that her killing accelerated and became more personal. She murdered patients she cared for, but also landlords, friends, and family members. The victims included her foster sister Elizabeth Brigham and Elizabeth's entire family, husband and 2 daughters, killed in quick succession in 1899, apparently after Toppin had developed resentment over feeling excluded from the family despite the Toppin name she carried. Her landlord and his wife, Alden and Mary Davis, killed in 1901 after Alden began investigating financial irregularities in Toppin's dealings. Genevieve Gordon, Mary Davis's sister, who became suspicious after the Davis deaths and began her own investigation, only to become Toppin's next victim when she accepted Toppin's offer to nurse her through an illness that was actually Toppin's poisoning. By 1901, the cluster of deaths around Jane Toppin had become too obvious to ignore. When yet another member of the Davis family became ill after Toppin's care, the remaining relatives demanded a toxicology examination. The autopsy revealed lethal levels of morphine and atropine. The investigation and confession, once toxicology results confirmed poisoning, investigators began exhuming other bodies and examining deaths connected to Jane Toppin. The pattern became undeniable. Wherever Jolly Jane had worked, death rates had been elevated. Patients, employers, and acquaintances had died under suspicious circumstances. And Toppin always had access, opportunity, and specialized knowledge of exactly which drugs to use and in what combinations. Confronted with mounting evidence, Toppin confessed, not reluctantly or with remorse, but with what investigators described as disturbing enthusiasm. She admitted to 33 murders spanning her nursing career from 1885 to 1901. She described her methods in clinical detail, and she explained her motivation with a frankness that shocked even hardened investigators. She killed, she said, because it gave her sexual pleasure. The power over life and death, the control of bringing someone to the brink and deciding whether they lived or died, the intimacy of holding dying patients as they passed, all of this she found arousing. She compared the sensation to sexual climax, describing it as the most intense pleasure she had ever experienced. She also articulated her ambition clearly. She wanted to be history's most prolific killer. She wanted the distinction of having murdered more people than anyone else. The fame, the notoriety, the recognition of being the deadliest, this appealed to her as much as the sexual gratification of the killings themselves. The confession created a sensation. Newspapers covered the case extensively, with headlines expressing shock and fascination with this cheerful nurse who had been systematically murdering vulnerable people for sexual pleasure. The Clinton Morning Age newspaper dubbed her the greatest criminal of modern times, recognition that, perversely, was exactly what Toppin had wanted. The trial and verdict. Jane Toppin's trial in 1902 centered not on whether she had committed the murders she had confessed in explicit detail, but on her mental state. Was she legally sane and therefore criminally responsible, or was she insane and therefore not guilty by reason of mental defect? Her defense team argued that her sexual arousal from killing, her explicit ambition to be history's greatest murderer, and her lack of remorse all indicated severe mental illness. They presented her as fundamentally broken, driven by psychological compulsions she couldn't control, unable to distinguish right from wrong in any meaningful sense. Prosecutors countered that Toppin had demonstrated clear premeditation, careful planning, and deliberate efforts to avoid detection, all indicating she understood her actions were wrong and chose to commit them anyway. The fact that her motivation was sexual rather than financial didn't make her insane. It just made her motivation unusual. The jury ultimately found Jane Toppin not guilty by reason of insanity. Whether this verdict reflected genuine belief in her insanity or simply reflected the jury's inability to comprehend executing a woman for sexually motivated murders is unclear. Mental health understanding in 1902 was primitive by modern standards, and the concept of sexual sadism or paraphilia that involves killing wasn't well developed in psychiatric literature of the era. The verdict meant Toppin would be committed to Taunton Insane Hospital, now Taunton State Hospital, rather than executed or imprisoned in a conventional facility. She would spend the rest of her life in psychiatric confinement. Life in the asylum. Jane Toppin lived for another 36 years after her trial, spending all of that time at Taunton Insane Hospital. Reports from the facility describe her as a model patient, cooperative, pleasant, maintaining the Jolly Jane persona that had served her so well during her nursing career. She continued to express no remorse for her crimes. In conversations with doctors and staff, she reportedly maintained that she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply pursued pleasure in the way she found most satisfying. The lack of guilt or empathy, combined with her cheerful demeanor, created a disturbing cognitive dissonance for those who interacted with her. Did the confinement bother her? Records suggest not particularly. She had food, shelter, and safety. She was somewhat famous, or infamous, which appealed to her desire for recognition. And she had achieved at least part of her ambition. She was remembered, discussed, written about. If she couldn't be history's most prolific killer, subsequent killers would surpass her confirmed count, she could at least be its first famous female serial murderer in a medical setting. She died at Taunton on August 17, 1938, at the age of 84, having outlived virtually all of her victims and most of the people who had known her during her nursing career. She was buried in an unmarked grave, her final resting place deliberately obscured to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction. As cases continue emerging worldwide, new forensic techniques and hospital protocols offer hope for preventing the next angel of death. The problem we still face, the cases documented in this series, from Jane Toppin's 33 murders in the early 1900s to the ongoing appeal of Colin Norris's conviction, might seem like historical aberrations, extreme outliers in an otherwise safe healthcare system. The uncomfortable truth is that medical serial killing remains an ongoing problem, not a relic of less sophisticated times. Research estimates that healthcare serial killings occur at a rate of approximately 35 per year in the United States alone. This translates to roughly 1 every 10 days. A healthcare worker somewhere in America systematically murdering patients under their care. Globally, the numbers are even more sobering. Since 1970, there have been at least 151 prosecuted cases involving healthcare serial killers, with 317 confirmed murders and 2,113 additional suspicious deaths attributed to convicted caregivers. These numbers represent only detected cases. Instances where patterns were recognized, investigations launched, and prosecutions secured. The actual number of healthcare workers currently killing patients is unknown and unknowable, but experts believe that many cases go undetected, with murders mistaken for natural deaths or medical complications. The demographic patterns remain consistent with historical cases. 86% of healthcare serial killers are nurses, 12% are physicians, and the remainder include nursing assistants, respiratory therapists, and other medical professionals. The victims are overwhelmingly vulnerable populations. The elderly in nursing homes and hospitals, premature infants in neonatal units, and critically ill patients in intensive care settings, those least able to defend themselves and whose deaths are most easily attributed to underlying medical conditions. Why healthcare settings remain vulnerable. So, despite more than a century of awareness about medical serial killers, dating back to Jane Toppin's exposure in 1901, healthcare facilities continued to provide environments where determined killers can operate for extended periods before detection. Several systemic factors contribute to this ongoing vulnerability. Access to lethal means. Healthcare workers have legitimate access to drugs and equipment that can easily cause death. Opioids, insulin, paralytics, potassium chloride, and syringes for injection. While medication security has improved significantly since the days when nurses could freely access any drug in the pharmacy, determined killers still find ways to divert controlled substances or use readily available materials like bleach and air to commit murders. Interestingly, improved controls on some murder methods have simply pushed killers toward others. The FDA's 2004 implementation of barcode medication systems requiring electronic scanning and documentation of drug administration has made it difficult to divert insulin and other controlled substances without creating an audit trail. Studies have shown a corresponding shift in methods. Recent cases increasingly involve bleach injections, as in the Kimberly Science case, and air embolisms rather than pharmaceutical poisonings, because these methods don't require accessing controlled medication supplies. Vulnerable patient populations. The patients most likely to be targeted by healthcare serial killers are those whose deaths are expected and whose causes of death are rarely questioned. Elderly patients with multiple medical conditions, premature infants with tenuous physiological stability, and critically ill patients in intensive care units. These populations have high baseline mortality rates, making statistical anomalies harder to detect, and individual deaths easier to attribute to natural causes. Cremation, increasingly common as burial costs rise and cultural preferences shift, eliminates forensic evidence that might later prove murder. Many of the cases documented in this series involved victims who were cremated before suspicions arose, making it impossible to definitively prove poisoning even when statistical patterns strongly suggested murder. This loss of physical evidence benefits killers and frustrates investigators. Systemic pressures and institutional failures. Healthcare facilities face chronic staffing shortages, particularly for nursing positions. This pressure to fill shifts and maintain staffing ratios can lead to hiring decisions that overlook warning signs. Unexplained gaps in employment history, multiple short-term positions at different facilities, terminations that aren't fully explained in reference checks, or even outright red flags like previous drug diversion incidents. The Charles Cullen case demonstrated this problem starkly. He moved between facilities for 16 years, being fired or forced to resign from multiple positions due to suspicious deaths, medication errors, and concerning behavior. Yet each new facility hired him without adequate investigation of his background. The system prioritized filling nursing positions over thoroughly vetting candidates. Additionally, hospitals and healthcare systems often fear legal and reputational consequences of reporting suspicions that might prove unfounded. If a facility accuses a staff member of murder and the accusation proves incorrect, they risk defamation lawsuits and the loss of valuable employees. If they report suspicions to law enforcement and media coverage damages their reputation, they face potential loss of patients and revenue. These institutional incentives sometimes result in quietly firing or allowing resignations rather than reporting to authorities, enabling killers to simply move to the next facility and continue their crimes. Detection difficulties. Distinguishing murder from natural death or medical error in hospital settings remains extraordinarily difficult, even with modern forensic capabilities. Many drugs used to kill metabolize quickly or are naturally present in the body, making post-mortem detection challenging. Deaths that appear to result from cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or sepsis might actually be murders that are never recognized as such. Statistical analysis can identify patterns, elevated mortality rates during specific shifts or linked to specific staff members. But these analyses require someone to look for the pattern, sophisticated data systems to track the relevant variables, and institutional willingness to investigate rather than dismiss concerning findings. Many facilities lack the statistical capabilities to detect patterns, and even when patterns are identified, cognitive biases can lead to innocent explanations being accepted rather than pursuing investigations that might reveal uncomfortable truths.